out of here at 12:30 or before, so we're going to try to make that happen if we can. All right, the Subcommittee on Oversight and Investigations will now come to order. And I recognize myself for 5 minutes for an opening statement. Welcome, Secretary Becerra. I appreciate you keeping your word and appearing before this subcommittee related to the Office of Refugee Resettlement, or ORR. ORR is an agency of the Department of Health and Human Services and is responsible for the care and placement of unaccompanied children referred to it by the Border Patrol. Under the Biden administration, ORR has faced an unprecedented surge in the number of unaccompanied minors referred to its custody. The numbers of unaccompanied minors crossing our border is astronomically high. From fiscal years 2018 through 2020, ORR averaged around 44,500 referrals per year. As of March 31st, 2023, which is the last time ORR made their numbers public, the agency had received almost 60,000 referrals in fiscal year 2023, putting the agency on pace for over 120,000 referrals for the third year in a row. Now, you and I don't agree on the policies that brought these children to our border, but I believe no matter the policies, once they are in our care and we have taken on the responsibility for them, we must care for them properly. Today's hearing is to take stock of how HHS and ORR have responded to the surge of these children. When thousands of vulnerable children were in ORR custody by an agency under your leadership, what was the message you sent to the frontline workers managing the border crisis? Hopefully, it was to make sure that these children are placed in safe environments with people they are actually related to. Hopefully also was to make sure that state and local child welfare agencies were aware that vulnerable children were being placed in their jurisdictions and would likely need services. But no matter the message you intended to send, it does appear that children's welfare was not a primary concern. Thanks to the whistleblower and the New York Times reporting, we know that there was constant neglect when handling the intake and release of these children. According to a recording obtained by the New York Times regarding ORR's unaccompanied minors, which I will submit for the record, you stated, if Henry Ford had seen this in his plants, he would have never become famous and rich. This is not the way you do an assembly line, end quote. Is that statement consistent with how you've intended to run ORR's unaccompanied children's program? While I hope not, the overriding priority seems to have been moving children out of ORR facilities as quickly as possible and not protecting them. That would explain why you would have approved policies like ORR Field Guidance 10, which expedites release of minors to people claiming to be family members, while simultaneously waiving background checks to ensure the potential sponsor is in fact a family member. It would also explain your approval of ORR Field Guidance 11, which waives background check requirements for unrelated adults who live in the same residence a minor is being sent to. This is of great concern, and I have been vocal about the failure of ORR to provide bona fide background checks. In 2021, I visited the emergency intake operation at Fort Bliss, Texas. I was shocked with what I learned there. There was no collaboration with law enforcement for real background checks when vetting sponsors, and the, quote, public records check, end quote, that they were using was merely a widely available internet search engine. My suspicions were solidified by a September 2022 OIG report on Fort Bliss. Under your leadership, ORR has issued requests for proposals and contracts worth billions of dollars for what seem to be large permanent influx care facilities designed to quickly process hundreds of minors. My fear is that no matter what your intentions may be, you may be putting ORR on a permanent assembly line footing where child welfare simply is not a priority. As I close, I'd like to enter into the record a report by a statewide grand jury in Florida charged with investigating ORR. This report, Mr. Secretary, is damning. It details chapter and verse how ORR's policies and practices have resulted in child exploitation and trafficking. I'll end by quoting the grand jury's assessment. If any resident of Florida exposed U.S., quote, if any resident of Florida exposed U.S.-born children to this process, they would be justifiably arrested for child neglect or worse. We do not think children should be less protected simply because they were born outside our borders and brought here by a government agency. I've been saying that for years. As a former domestic relations lawyer in Virginia, the same related to the legal standard would be true in Virginia as well. OR actions are equal to neglect. The child's legal status in this country is irrelevant, and OR must do better. I yield back. I now recognize the gentlewoman from Florida, Ms. Castor, the ranking member of this subcommittee, for her 5-minute opening statement.
Well, thank you very much, Mr. Chairman. Welcome, Mr. Secretary. Unaccompanied children seeking refuge in the U.S. are some of the most vulnerable among us. They often cross the border alone, escaping persecution, violence, and abuse. The experience would be frightening and confusing for anyone, let alone a child who may not speak English. So we have a moral and legal obligation to ensure that unaccompanied children are safe and cared for. The Office of Refugee Resettlement is tasked under the law with the responsibility to keep unaccompanied children well and safe from the time they are transferred from the Department of Homeland Security to the time they are placed with vetted sponsors who are more often than not family members. Earlier this year, news reports detailed cases of unaccompanied minors working in harsh conditions in plants and factories. The reports were shocking and deeply disturbing. Businesses are exploiting children as a source of cheap labor and preying on their financial desperation. This type of child exploitation must not be tolerated. Even though ORR has limited authorities under the law and limited resources, there is more that can be done to protect these children. For example, ORR is now expanding oversight and services to children after they are placed with families and sponsors per the funding that Congress provided in last year's Omnibus Appropriations Bill. ORR is also working more closely with the Department of Labor to address labor issues, and the HHS Inspector General recommended, and as the HHS Inspector General recommended, HHS is working to expand network capacity and modernize the portal that allows OR to monitor the best interests of the children. I look forward to hearing from you, Mr. Secretary, about OR's work to eliminate the risk of labor trafficking, to enhance services after the placement with sponsors, and to improve the reporting of abuse. That is the kind of oversight that this subcommittee must be doing, and I commend the chair for this hearing and to the secretary for attending. But this meaningful oversight effort is an exception because the majority has been focused on various partisan tangents. Most of this Congress aimed at sowing distrust in public servants in our health institutions. One far-out tangent that I hope we can put to rest is the GOP's baseless allegations regarding the validity of certain NIH institute and center directors. For months, Energy and Commerce Republicans have made unfounded claims that 14 directors of NIH institutes and centers served illegally for over 2 years because they were not directly reappointed by Secretary Becerra. The GOP members point to a section of the 21st Century Cures Act holding up a graphic that states that such directors shall be appointed by the Secretary. But they intentionally obscured the most important part of that statute, which states that when making director appointments, the Secretary acts through the director of the National Institutes of Health. Republicans inexplicably blurred out the clear language of the statute. Why? It appears to be an attempt to spin up yet another conspiracy. This is especially bizarre because it was Republicans who insisted on transferring the authority to appoint NIH-IC directors from the Secretary to the Director of NIH over the objections of the Obama administration in 2016. It is wrong to deliberately mislead the public, and it is strange to do so involving language that GOP members wrote themselves. This Congress, my Republican colleagues have taken every opportunity to intimidate scientists and malign public health officials. In sowing distrust In our vital health research agencies and public health experts, Republicans are playing a dangerous game. Americans depend on the work of these dedicated public servants to keep us safe and healthy, and it's time for the harassment to end. This committee has real work to do on so many issues: preparing for the next pandemic, tackling devastating drug shortages, protecting online privacy, and developing solutions to reduce climate pollution that's wreaking havoc and costing us more every day. The care of unaccompanied children is among the issues that demands Congress's attention. So let's focus on that issue today instead of the fabricated ones. Mr. Secretary, we are committed to making sure ORR does its job and does it right. Thank you for being here today, and I look forward to the discussion of these real issues. I yield back my time.
Appreciate gentlelady yielding back. Now recognize the gentlelady from Washington, the chairwoman of the full committee, Ms. McMorris Rogers, for her 5 minutes of opening statement.
Secretary Becerra, today we as the elected representatives of the people seek answers and transparency from you as the Secretary of Health and Human Services. Today we're working to assure the safety and well-being of unaccompanied children crossing the border, some of the most vulnerable among us. Under President Biden, we've faced the worst border crisis in our history. ORR received referrals for more than 350,000 unaccompanied children over the course of the first 3 years of this presidency. That is more than 120,000 unaccompanied minors passing through ORR's custody annually. This is unprecedented. Prior to President Biden, the largest single year of total referrals was about 69,000. As the New York Times has uncovered, this border crisis has left children alone and exploited. And these are just a few of the gut-wrenching examples. 13 and 14-year-olds are working 12-hour shifts on farms and factories. Children dropping out of school or never signing up because they owe a debt to the smuggler that trafficked them. Children running away from their sponsors, the ones that ORR placed them with, because they were being sold for sex. We're going to talk a lot about the 85,000 children that ORR could not contact after placement. ORR claims that its 81% successful post-release contact rate is a significant accomplishment. It's not a success when the agency has lost contact with a third of the migrant children during the first 2 years of the Biden administration. And the post-release follow-up is already a low bar. ORR considers it a success if they merely speak with a child or a sponsor over the phone. Secretary Becerra, I'm especially concerned about specific policies and practices that you've put in place that prevent ORR from vetting sponsors. Why would you waive criminal background checks, including checks of the sex offender and the child abuse registries for sponsors and other adults living in households where children are placed? Why would you allow, under your watch, digital fingerprinting to confirm the identity of the sponsors to drop by 55%? Why would you allow at least 30,000 minors to be handed over to someone ORR knows that they're not related to? As an internal memo revealed, the department has become, quote, one that rewards individuals for making quick releases and not one that rewards individuals for preventing unsafe releases. The consequences of these decisions are entirely foreseeable. And again, thanks to the New York Times, we know that reports reached your desk that children were at risk. The American people must know how you could possibly have ignored these warning signs and continue to put more children in danger of exploitation. As I mentioned, this isn't the only example of mismanagement and abuses of power at HHS. As Secretary, you failed to follow the law and the Constitution to reappoint the 14 NIH officials, including Dr. Fauci. As a result, they exercised power and authority they didn't legally have in approving billions of dollars in taxpayer-funded grants. There's a crisis of confidence at our public health agencies, including CDC, FDA, and NIH. CMS is denying seniors approved Alzheimer's medications and dragging its feet on meaningful price transparency rules to lower drug costs. The FDA's baby formula shortage caused panic and harm to mothers, fathers, and children across the nation. And you failed to provide us the transparency for President Biden's radical spending agenda that fueled record-breaking inflation. And the HHS OIG just reported a massive amount of fraud and waste in the COVID-19 uninsured program, which grew dramatically under your watch. For the sake of time, I won't go on. But I'll close by saying this. HHS has lost sight of its mission. As Chair Griffith said, there seems to be more concern with politics and power than the American people's safety and well-being. And I'm very concerned about a culture of arrogance and lawlessness. As I started, we're the elected representatives of the people, and we are demanding transparency and responsiveness. This culture must change, and it must change at the very top, starting with your leadership and taking responsibility for your actions. You're testifying before the committee under oath. We expect and need honest and complete answers for what has happened. Thank you, and I yield back.
Gentlelady yields back, and now recognize the ranking member of the full committee, Mr. Pallone, for his 5-minute opening statement.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Earlier this year, I was alarmed by reports of children who came to this country alone only to be exploited by their sponsors and companies that illegally employed them. And I'm pleased that Secretary Becerra is here to explain what the Office of Refugee Settlement is doing to better address this cruel abuse. ORR has been in a difficult position. Its budget and authorities are limited, particularly in the period after a child is released into the custody of his sponsor. This is a critical time for the detection and remediation of any exploitation. In 2021, the Biden administration inherited a crisis in the aftermath of the Trump administration's inhumane family separation policy, and ORR acted quickly to reunify families, place children in the care of sponsors, build emergency facilities, and hire staff, and those efforts were necessary. But responding to this crisis also revealed areas for improvement. ORR must stay vigilant in its work to identify and respond to exploitation, both in the sponsor vetting process and when they're released into the care of their sponsor. And I look forward to hearing how ORR is accelerating this important work, including through its joint efforts with the Department of Labor to combat illegal child labor. This hearing is entitled Stopping the Exploitation of Migrant Children, and everyone fully supports that goal. Unfortunately, I believe the actions that my Republican colleagues are taking would make this situation worse, not better. This Congress, Republicans have routinely tried to chip away at the right to legal asylum. Even as they decried child exploitation, Republicans nearly unanimously supported legislation that would reverse critical safeguards for kids who were trafficked. And this Republican action would leave these kids in Department of Homeland Security facilities for up to 10 times as long as the legal limit. And Republicans continue to cave to their extreme right wing of their party by pushing for dramatic budget cuts that would set back any progress that ORR has made in protecting unaccompanied minors. For example, most recently, House Republicans on the Appropriations Committee are pushing an annual funding bill that would cut the unaccompanied children's program funding by $3.3 billion in the upcoming fiscal year. This drastic funding cut would severely hinder the office's ability to provide services like mental health care and legal services that would help detect and prevent the very kind of abuse that this hearing is supposedly about. And frankly, tearing down important agencies rather than supporting their essential work has been a theme this year under the Republican majority. While our committee has traditionally been able to stay above the fray, I'm concerned that is no longer the case. The Republican majority continues to push a legally flawed theory that 14 National Institutes of Health centers and institute directors were improperly appointed. These allegations ignore language in the 21st Century Cures Act that they put in, former Republican Chair Fred Upton and former Congressman Joe Barton, deliberately saying that the Secretary should act through the NIH Director. So this so-called investigation simply is not based in law. It's also a huge waste of the committee and its members' time. We have so many more important issues to deal with than this. Committee Republicans have also continued other baseless investigations, including harassing a senior NIH scientist to sit for a transcribed interview about a research project that never occurred. They continue to press the theory that COVID-19 leaked from the Wuhan Institute of Virology without any real evidence. They're fixated on manufacturing partisan scandals to discredit the work of our public servants, intimidate researchers, and promote frivolous litigation. Again, we have so many more important issues to deal with. The Republican majority's attacks only distract from the important oversight work that children deserve and that Americans depend on. And I look forward to hearing from Secretary Becerra about how ORR plans to identify and respond to violations of children's rights. But again, thank you, Mr. Chairman, and I look forward to hearing from the Secretary.
That concludes, thank you, Mr. Ranking Member, for yielding back. That concludes the members' opening statements. The chair would like to remind members that pursuant to committee rules, all members' written opening statements will be made a part of the record. Please provide those to the clerk promptly. We want to thank you, Mr. Secretary, for being here with us today and taking your time to testify before this subcommittee. You will have an opportunity to give an opening statement followed by a round of questions from members. I think it's pretty obvious that our witness today is Secretary Becerra of the Department of Health and Human Services. We look forward to hearing from you, and I will now recognize you for your opening statement. You want me to swear him in first? All right. I was going to let you give your opening statement before we swore you in. You are aware this committee is holding an oversight hearing, and in doing so, we have the practice of taking our testimony under oath. Do you have any objection to testifying under oath? You are also entitled to, seeing no objection, will proceed. The chair advises you are also entitled to be advised by counsel pursuant to House rules. Do you desire to be advised by counsel during your testimony today? And the witness has indicated that's not necessary, so if you would please rise and raise your right hand. Do you promise to tell the truth, the whole truth, and nothing but the truth, so help you God? The gentleman has affirmatively so stated, and you are now sworn in and under oath and subject to the penalty set forth in Title 18, Section 1001 of the United States Code. With that, we'll now recognize you for your 5-minute opening statement.
Mr. Chairman and members, thank you for the opportunity to appear before you today. I'm here at the chairman's request to discuss the Department of Health and Human Services Unaccompanied Children Program within the Office of Refugee Resettlement, and the work that we are continually doing to ensure the safety and well-being of children in our care. The UC program's mandate is directed at providing temporary care and shelter for unaccompanied children and securing appropriately vetted sponsors who can assume custody and provide a home for the children during the pendency of their immigration proceedings. I want to address reports that have flagged an increase in children being employed illegally and exploited by companies. This is real, it's repulsive, and it's unacceptable. I say this as the son of a road construction worker who, as the oldest child, had to leave school after the 6th grade. He never got to go back. Unlawful child labor is not limited to migrant children, but unaccompanied children released from ORR custody may be particularly vulnerable to unscrupulous employers. HHS is coordinating with the Department of Labor and other partners to assist their efforts to further crack down on illegal child labor. At HHS, we follow the law. Employers and companies should do the same. HHS is proud to do our part in the critical work to care for unaccompanied children. We have a dedicated team of professionals at ORR who oversee their care and placement with vetted sponsors. I hold our team and the entire department to the highest standard to ensure we are delivering on our mission to provide care that is in the child's best interest. Let me be clear about how we approach this work. ORR funds nearly 300 programs in 27 states, such as shelter programs, transitional care, long-term care, group homes, staff secure facilities, and residential treatment centers. At these facilities, ORR provides child-appropriate services, including education, healthcare and counseling services, case management services, recreation, access to legal services, access to religious services, and access to child advocates where applicable. These services are delivered according to child welfare best practices in a manner that is appropriate to the age, culture, preferred language, and needs of each child. ORR also works to maintain a preparedness posture by ensuring it can quickly scale up capacity if needed. We know, and child welfare experts will tell you, that the best place for a child is in a home, with a family, in a community, not in a congregate care setting. That is why we work so hard to find appropriate custodial sponsors for these children. This fiscal year, ORR has placed over 83,000 children with vetted sponsors. More than 85% of those children released to vetted sponsors were placed with a parent, legal guardian, or close family member. The average length of time a child spends in HHS care before being placed with a vetted sponsor is currently less than 1 month. Of course, it is not always possible to place a child with a parent, legal guardian, or close family member. In these cases, which is fewer than 15% of children, OR takes steps, additional steps and precautions in the sponsor vetting process prior to the placement of the child. HHS's custodial responsibility for unaccompanied children legally ends once we place them in the custody of a vetted sponsor. Nevertheless, ORR has enacted policies to help identify challenges and opportunities to support and protect children following their release from HHS's custody. This is where there seems to be the most misunderstanding, Mr. Chairman. In fact, I heard that just a while ago. So, Mr. Chairman, let me repeat what I just said. HHS's custodial responsibility for unaccompanied children legally ends once we place them in the custody of a vetted sponsor. That's not me saying it, that's Congress's law as it was passed into statute. But HHS, we at HHS, we voluntarily do more to support and protect these children. Furthermore, we are committed to expanding access to post-release services with adequate funding appropriated by Congress. Mr. Chairman, children are children, but the children who have come into OR care face unique challenges that require a whole-of-government approach, including our partners in Congress, fellow federal agencies, state and local agencies, and national and community partners. I hope that we can continue to work together to care for and support children in the best interest of our nation. I thank you, and I yield back.
Gentleman yields back. I thank you for your testimony. We'll now move into the question and answer portion of the hearing, and I will begin questioning by recognizing myself for 5 minutes. All right, let's talk about these kids. Your duty ends once they're properly placed. Question number one, it's my understanding that you all do not notify the local Department of Social Services or other local child welfare agency in the community in which a child is being placed. Is that correct, yes or no?
Mr. Chairman, we have to protect the privacy of children, as you would expect for any child, and so we try not to provide information about the child.
So you don't provide that information to local child welfare agencies that the child's been placed there, or the school system, isn't that correct?
We work with the local agencies once a child has been placed, if there's a need to support them with regard to, for example, school or other social services. So we will work with local agencies where necessary.
Right. When a familial relationship is claimed, do you all do any kind of a DNA test to establish a genetic link between the sponsor and the child? And I asked that question, and it became more poignant last night as I was watching Sound of Freedom, because the bad guy was bringing a child who'd been kidnapped across the border. The good guys were there to intercept, but he presented fake documents claiming to be the uncle of the child. So do you all do a DNA test? Because I just got to tell you, Mr. Secretary, my information indicates that you all only do a DNA test in about 23% of the cases, and that's usually looking for child predators of some sort, not familial relationship. Is that true?
Mr. Chairman, we go through a thorough vetting process for each and every sponsor. We make every effort to try to find the closest relative for that child. And one of the tools that we use is DNA testing, voluntary DNA testing.
But you don't do that in every case where familial relationship is claimed. Isn't that true?
Well, we make sure we verify the identity of the person. So, for example, we will use birth certificates. We will use other documentation that proves who the individual is.
But a birth certificate coming from another country, just like the passports presented in the film last night, may be forged. You would agree that documents can be forged, and that's not necessarily reliable. Man, I just got to tell you, I'm a member of Ancestry.com, and I have their DNA test. They can tell me about fourth cousins that I never knew existed on my father's side. There's a way to do this, and if we're truly going to properly vet before we place these children, we need to be doing more DNA testing. Let me move on.
And that's why we use DNA testing where it can help.
Well, occasionally. I'd like to go over the sponsor vetting process in more detail. I checked this morning, and field guidances 10 and 11 are still in effect. OR continues to waive background checks for people claiming to be distant family members and for other adults who live in the house where the child is being placed. With that as a background, I would have to ask that OR only completed fingerprint checks in 23% of cases. What percentage of sponsors now have completed fingerprint checks before you place a child with them?
And Mr. Chairman, we place the care and well-being of every unaccompanied child as our highest priority. And that's why I need to clarify what you and others have said, because you've misunderstood Field Guidance 10 and 11. You applied it to every child, and it does not apply to every child, those two guidances. Field Guidance 10 applies to only to children who are either eligible to be assigned to a parent, a legal guardian, or
Or somebody who purports to be a close family relative. We've already been there. Okay, let me ask you this.
and that we have to document and prove before we release that child.
You have documents, but they might be forged. All right.
We do everything to make sure that no one gets through the process
sir.
by providing fraud. In fact, I just had a conversation with case managers about a very case where someone tried to present fraudulent information.
And I appreciate that. Look, let me make this clear to everybody. I know you got a tough job, and I want to work with you to try to solve some of these problems.
Appreciate your saying that.
But I am concerned when I see statements like what appeared in the New York Times article, which I've asked to be incorporated into the record, where according to the recording, it says, you said, if Henry Ford had seen this in his plants, he would have never become famous and rich. This is not the way you do an assembly line. You want to explain that? I'm going to give you a chance to explain that, because that's a damning statement. And on top of the Florida report, which says that, which I agree with, that if we were treating U.S. children this way, it'd be considered neglect and somebody'd be going to jail. Please explain.
And thank you, Mr. Chairman, for giving me a chance to explain, because there is a very simple explanation for that. As you said yourself, and as I think every member has said, we were facing deep challenges trying to make sure that children were not stuck in the Department of Homeland Security's adult detention facilities. That is not a place for children. So we needed to make sure we had a safe place for them to be, good bed, the care they needed. So we needed to be very efficient with the work we were doing to always have a bed available. So what I said is, we need to make sure we're working efficiently. It's about process, not people. Henry Ford would not have become famous simply because he produced a lot of vehicles. He became famous because he produced good quality vehicles at a time when it was tough to do so. We want to do quality work. You can't do that if one day you do well and the next day you don't. My comment dealt with the process, not the people.
Well, and I will close by just saying that I still think there's a lot to be done. I'm glad to hear you say
Absolutely.
those things, but there's a lot to be done, because I think we're letting too many children, and even one is not acceptable, but we're having hundreds or thousands of children who are slipping through the cracks, and a better job needs to be done. And I think using more DNA testing and more real background checks instead of just a background check that is some internet search engine would be helpful.
Look forward to
I yield
working
back and now recognize the ranking member of the subcommittee, Ms. Castor, for 5 minutes.
Well, thank you, Mr. Chairman. These stories of corporations and businesses exploiting children for cheap labor to maximize their profits are just appalling. So I've learned digging into this that after HHS and the Office of Refugee Resettlement places an unaccompanied child with a sponsor, often a family member, that the legal authority for HHS ends. But as Congress provided in the last appropriations bill, we've given extra money to ORR to do better, to begin to allow HHS to provide post-release services to all unaccompanied children. And HHS has set a goal to do that for all children by 2024. I'm pleased that ORR has doubled the rate of children receiving such services from fiscal year 21 to 22, and Congress now needs to monitor the progress here. When you say that ORR will provide post-release services to 100% of unaccompanied children, what does that mean in practice? And what kind of services and support can children expect to receive?
Congressman, first, I want to thank you for making it clear. It is tough to do work when you don't have the legal authority to do more. We would love to do everything we do while we have the child in our custody, but once we release that child into the hands of a vetted sponsor, we lose that custodial responsibility. And so if Congress wishes to give us more responsibility to watch over these kids, even after they have been assigned to a sponsor, please go right ahead, because everyone cares about the care of these kids. What do we do? What does it mean to have post-release services? And again, these are mostly all voluntary because we don't have authority to actually require kids or the sponsors to respond back to us. But we do child checks. We want to make sure that they're okay once they transition out. So we make an effort to call them. The kids and the sponsors are under no obligation to answer the call or return the call. We also provide services to those who may be in need of particular social services, mental health services, educational services. So we'll try to do post-release services there. All of that is principally contingent on Congress giving us the funding to do that, because that's not the core activity that you've given us money to do. If you institute the cuts that I see the House is moving towards, it would devastate our program, not just to provide post-release services, but just to do the basic work of caring for these kids in our centers, in our licensed facilities.
So these post-release services, they're wellness check-ins where you call and it's really up to the sponsors and the children to weigh in. Can we do better on that? Do you prioritize in any way? Some of the unaccompanied children don't go with a parent or a family member. Does that kind of raise the bar for those check-ins?
Yeah, we're always looking for ways to provide better care. Remember, these are kids who are coming to us, many suffering from a great deal of trauma, and so we do everything we can while they're in our care, and we're trying to do everything we can even after we lose custody of them when they are with their vetted sponsor. So we're constantly looking for ways to do that. One of the ways we're doing that, especially on labor exploitation, is working with the Department of Labor through a formal memorandum of agreement where we will try to each share information so we can track if an employer is being abusive and if there's a child who may be the subject of abuse in labor.
Does this include legal services? Because these children now are often, they're going into the immigration service, or if there's a case of child exploitation, those attorneys or advocates are kind of their best hope for justice. Does this include legal services?
It does, and we are under statute required to provide it to certain individuals. So if a child has come to us and we have information that the child was being exploited, sexually exploited, for example, before coming into our care, we are required by law to make sure we provide follow-up services. But we try to provide those same kind of follow-up services, even to children that by statute we are not obligated to do so, because it makes sense. And so one of those areas is legal services. How far? It depends on how much resources you provide us so we can extend that service to them.
Thank you, Mr. Secretary. And I think it should go said to all of the folks across the country who are taking care of children, whether they're in group homes, they're counselors. I've visited churches in my district who are the trusted care providers for these unaccompanied children before they're released to their sponsors. And I just want to say thank you to all of the folks who are working to keep kids healthy and well.
I'll take that back. Thank you.
Gentlelady yields back. Now recognize the chairwoman of the full committee, Ms. McMorris-Rogers, for her. I now recognize Dr. Burgess. Sorry, just going off rote. Recognize Dr. Burgess for his 5 minutes of questions. The gentleman from Texas is recognized.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. And I do want to start out by saying it is this committee, indeed this subcommittee, which established a lot of the accompanied immigrant child going back to 2014 when we had the vast influx of Central American children down at Lackland Air Force Base in San Antonio. And it was only the oversight of this committee that provided those children a modicum of medical screenings and medical care. Now, continuing on the chairman's line of questioning about the use of verifiable DNA evidence, it was actually found in the previous administration that when you did that, and that's a little upstream from your responsibilities, but when there was an attempt made to verify parentage or familial relationship, those cases dropped dramatically because the people who were using a child as basically a get-out-of-jail-free card to come into this country recognized that if they were a non-match with genetic material, they were going to be charged with kidnapping. And so it was a pretty serious business, and those numbers did diminish. Now, you can agree or disagree with the rightness or wrongness of doing that certification of parentage, But I agree with the chairman, that simply querying Google as to whether or not someone is someone's uncle or aunt is probably not satisfactory when you have within your capability the ability to scientifically check. And then, unfortunately, that leads to situations from a Florida statewide grand jury investigation. A single-family home in Austin, Texas had more than 100 children sent to it by Office of Refugee Resettlement, not by the cartels, by you all. Another Texas address had 44 children, and a third had 25. Again, sent to them by ORR, not by the cartels, but by you. That's the reason this needs to be as tight can be.
Dr. Burgess, let me first begin by saying in your early comments, you are absolutely right that especially with technology, it's becoming so much easier to forge documents. And it is really important that you try to prove that you are who you are, especially if you're going to get custody of a child. So we hear you, and we're willing to work with you because we're constantly striving to make sure that the person who's going to become that sponsor is who he or she says. So I fully agree with that point. I will say this on the point about sending a number of children into the same general geographic area.
No, the same house address, not the general geographic area.
Well, I would say to you, there is no home that I'm aware of that has gotten 40-some-odd kids. But what I will tell you is that there are places where immigrant communities flock. And so it should not surprise anyone that you have a lot of children that end up in the same communities because as my father ended up in Sacramento, California, because that's where a lot of his relatives and friends, his parents' relatives and friends.
If I may, this is not an isolated incident. The Houston chief of police, who's certainly not a Republican, also complained about the same phenomenon occurring in Houston, Texas. But we will provide to you, to your office, that information and would appreciate your response to that.
Absolutely.
Let me move on to another thing, and this has really troubled me for well over a decade. And when we were beginning our investigation in this committee on the medical screenings available to unaccompanied immigrant children, there's a concern about tuberculosis. Tuberculosis in the state of Texas is a reportable illness, but if you never look, you're never going to find it. And I remember the statements made to me were that, well, look, if you get a positive TB test, then this obligates you to a long period of therapy. The treatment is 10 months or longer. And if you don't follow through with treatment, you're going to lead to drug-resistant tuberculosis. So it is important to do the follow-through. So certainly testing wasn't done at CBP. Testing was not done at ORR because the children were not going to be in custody long enough. But it leads to a downstream problem, and you and I both know an episode of multiple drug-resistant TB in one of our neighborhood schools is going to be big trouble. Would you agree with that?
You point out something very real because, as you stated, we only have the child in our care for a short amount of time. And so we do work with not just CBP at the Department of Homeland Security. When the children come to us, we provide the medical care that they need while they are with us. We make sure that no child is infectious when we release them, but they have to follow up on something like tuberculosis with local healthcare authorities.
But the problem is the follow-through on that leaves a lot to be desired. At the same time, if the administration's priority seems to be facilitating abortions for a child who would want one, if we're willing to put that much energy into providing an abortion, shouldn't we put that much energy into providing to make certain a child is not infectious, carrying TB into our communities?
Dr. Burgess, you raise a great point on the tuberculosis issue. We would, if you gave us authority to actually follow a child, to make sure that the child is following through on medical or healthcare services that they need, especially to keep not just themselves but others safe, we would take that authority. But we don't have that authority. That's the difficulty that we're...
exists in current state law.
I'm sorry?
It's a reportable illness in the state of Texas.
Yeah, but we don't have an ability to require that action be taken. If the sponsor or the child's not getting the care, if some medical community is not offering the care, we don't have any ability to say, you really should do this for the safety of the community. We don't have that ability.
Reportable illness.
Gentleman's time is up. Sorry. Gentleman yields back. Now recognize the gentleman from New York, Mr. Tonko, for his 5 minutes of question.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. And thank you, Secretary, for appearing before the subcommittee, and thank you for the leadership that you provide and that of your team. Reports earlier this year cited criticism of ORR's sponsor vetting. I want to begin by asking about how the current process works and where there may be a need for improvement. ORR is legally obligated to release children to sponsors, and I quote, "without unnecessary delay." So ORR has to strike a careful balance between rigorously vetting sponsors and the reality that it cannot, legally or ethically, hold children in shelters indefinitely. Children held in any congregate care facility for prolonged periods of time can suffer damaging physical and psychological health effects. It is in the best interest of the child to release that individual to caring sponsors as soon as the sponsor is vetted as safe. So Secretary Becerra, your testimony goes into detail about the sponsor vetting process and the types of vetting that happens depending on the sponsor's relationship with the child. I want to make certain we all understand what happens during that vetting process and clear up any misconceptions. Can you briefly describe what goes into ORR's sponsor vetting process?
Congressman, thank you, because there is so much misunderstanding and misinformation about the vetting process. We begin by searching for a sponsor who is as close to the child as possible. Obviously, the parents would be the closest, guardian, adult sibling, grandparents. Those folks are what we call Category 1 sponsors because they are the closest to them. We have to go through the process of verifying that they are who they say they are. So each sponsor must submit a detailed application giving us information about their identity, their address, their relationship to the child. They must provide additional supporting documents. They must provide us with records, whether it's a birth certificate or whether it's a driver's license. They must go through background checks. They have to go through a home study where we actually send people to talk specifically with the potential sponsor and household members if we need to confirm more information. And oftentimes, we will also do voluntary DNA testing. But we do everything we can to certify, to verify that the people are who they say they are.
Thank you. And how does ORR's standard of review differ from considering a sponsor application from a close family member versus when it considers a sponsor application from a non-family member? And why is it important for ORR to differentiate between these categories of sponsors?
Thank you for that question, because again, people are confusing this. There are sponsors who are unrelated to the child, maybe close friends, but unrelated by blood to the child. We do far more work to try to make sure that that person is who he or she says he is or she is, because they're not related. And that Category 1, where it's the parent or the guardian or very close relative, if they are providing us with valid documentation, then we want, because it's in the best interest of the child, we try to move that child to that parent without delay. There was a time early in 2021 when there was delay because of the number of kids we had, and simply trying to get to all of the children was tough. Now that's why we are under 1 month of stay in our care, because we're able to now process, especially those Category 1 sponsors, far quicker, because so long as we get the valid information, there's no reason to keep a child from being with a parent or a legal guardian. If you're a relative but not a real close relative, well, we have to do more vetting to make sure that you are who you say you are. We contact the parents in the home country. We ask them to verify. We ask the children, do you know this individual? We go through a number of steps. That's why virtually all of the children that we release to a vetted sponsor are related to that sponsor, because we make every effort to make sure it's with family, hopefully very near family, parent, adult sibling, grandparent, or not, maybe a cousin, but we go through more checks. And if not a cousin, not a relative, then you're going to go through a lot of checks. That's why we have what we call our Category 4 kids. It's tough to find any type of relative sponsor. It's tough to find anyone who's a close friend that we have found verifiable. And so we have a category of children who've been in our care for quite some time. It's because we're not willing to let them go until we can verify that they will be with a trusted sponsor.
Thank you, sir. And Mr. Secretary, how is ORR evaluating its sponsorship guidelines in light of revelations of labor abuses happening post-release?
Congressman, as I said, my father was one of those kids. There was never any problem with him finding work, even though he was not even a teenager. And there were occasions when he would not get paid for his labor. We've known about child labor for a long time. It's not just migrant kids, but certainly with migrant kids. We have an obligation to do everything we can, and with every authority we have, and even beyond that, we're going to do everything we can to provide health and safety for those children, even after we've lost custody and care of that child.
Mr. Secretary, I again appreciate you appearing before the subcommittee, and thank you for your responses.
Thank you.
I yield back, Mr. Chair.
Gentleman yields back. Now recognize the gentleman from Kentucky.
Thanks, Mr. Secretary. Thanks for being here. And I just want to say, I'm sorry the tone that our ranking member took on this, because we all want to solve this problem. Nobody here wants children to be mistreated and move forward. Now, we could think we should control the border first and not have them here. But once they're here, we have to absolutely take care of them. I know we share that. We absolutely share that. So just kind of following on what Mr. Tonka was asking, you talked about non-related children. So there was a May 2023 audit that the Office of Refugee Resettlement's Inspector General found that 340 migrant children were released to non-relative sponsors who are already caring for other migrant children. And so you talked about you have to do the extra checks if they're not related. And my understanding, the OR must conduct in-depth home studies on sponsors who are sponsoring multiple unrelated children. How frequently does that take place?
With a Category 1, where we know that there's a parent and we just have to verify the parent, we really don't usually do the home studies.
Right, these are the unrelated, have multiple
Well,
migrants.
and Congressman, I want to point out, if we get some kind of click back after a background check where there's something suspicious about the background, even of the parent, we won't let the child go, even if it's a parent, until we can confirm that it's okay. We may do the home study even in that situation. But with someone who's not related, we definitely do the home study. We go in, we do the interviews, we try to make sure we can test the veracity of the person who's seeking to sponsor. And with someone who's not related, we also do checks of the other adults in that household.
I know sometimes that system gets overwhelmed, but that's done every time?
With anyone who is not a related, a potentially related sponsor, yes.
It's a rare exception if it doesn't, but it does most of the time. I understand that sometimes you get, so getting back to the labor situation, it's really concerning to all of us. I think I know we're all concerned about it. In February of this year, the Department of Labor found 102 children working in overnight jobs. And there was the situation with caustic chemicals to clean razor sharp saws. You know, we know that. So when that happens, how quickly do you respond? Does your office respond to that?
And Congressman, this is the point about all the misunderstanding going on. You all in Congress, when I was in Congress with you, we did, and as Congressman Burgess pointed out, this is, for years, we've had to live with the existing authorities that we have. We can't go to an employer and say, hey, you can't employ this kid. You're violating the law. We don't have the reach, the authorities to go do that. What we can do is try to reach the child and the sponsor and say, how are things going? But as I said earlier, we don't have any ability or requirement to say to that child or sponsor or the employer, get back to us and check in with us. And that's the difficulty here, is our authorities are very limited. If you wish to give us further authorities, we will absolutely work with you towards that.
Okay, so we need to debate that, obviously, and if that's appropriate, we ought to absolutely do that. So getting back to that, so the Department of Labor does have that. I understand there's a division in the cabinets with you. So your colleague Robin Dunn Marcos, the Director of Oversight Refugee Resettlement, stated in the House Oversight and Accountability Committee last month that you're working to strengthen the relationship with the Department of Labor and reducing them. Could you just update us then? I know that you don't have the authorities, Department of Labor does, but there's also some synergies that you guys can create because of the children. And so what's the status of that?
We have expanded the data sharing, and that's sometimes difficult because all that information, especially for children, is very private. So how we can share data, making sure that we don't violate anyone's rights to the information, helps, because if they have sight of a sponsor that we, for example, have found was trying to fraudulently get a child, they may say, hey, that name happens to come up when we do our search, and that helps them do their work. Vice versa, if they give us names of employers who are unscrupulous, if we see that all of a sudden one of those employers happens to be someone who's applying to be a sponsor, it helps us be more cautious. So we're sharing data. We have a memorandum of agreement to work more formalized. We've been doing this for a while, but this means we're trying to do it even more strongly. We're also going through training. We're training some of their folks at DOL to understand how ORR does its work. And DOL is training some of our folks in ORR and at HHS so that we understand better how they do their work. So this way we have insight about what we should try to do.
Are you already seeing fruits of that? Have you come across, I know we don't hear about every case that this happens. Have you seen where that synergy has worked?
Absolutely.
Some examples?
Absolutely. The data sharing. So we're able to better track. We were talking a little while about what we call hotspots, where there seem to be a lot of children who are being exploited for labor and where we may see a lot of migrant families. And what we then do is say, okay, we got a report from DOL that there's a lot of illegal hiring of kids in this community. Then we try to zero in to find out, okay, are we getting people who are trying to sponsor some of our children from that community?
Yeah, for the purpose of that, yeah, exactly. Well, thank you, and my time has expired, now yield back.
Gentleman yields back. Now recognize Mr. Peters of California for his 5 minutes of questioning. Oh, didn't see you slip in. Yeah. Recognize Dr. Ruiz for his 5 minutes of questioning. He slipped in and he has seniority.
Stealth. It's what you call a good second baseman, just getting it done quickly. So thank you for being here. Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Congress established the Office of Refugee Resettlement in part because putting children in indefinite adult immigration detention is unconscionable. I think back to just a few years ago when so many children were kept in protracted immigration detention, often in literal cages and separated from their families. These conditions were so abhorrent that I introduced a bill, the Humanitarian Standards for Individuals in Customs and Border Protection Custody Act, that would establish minimum standards of care in these facilities and ensure these children had access to basic human necessities while they awaited further processing. Unlike in immigration detention, in ORR care, children are provided with housing, shelter, clothing, educational services, and medical care. Republicans this Congress have proposed transferring some of the ORR's responsibilities to the Department of Homeland Security, but that would threaten the well-being of unaccompanied children. Instead, we need to focus on how ORR can best meet its obligation to provide high-quality care for children, including case management services by trained professionals that can provide culturally competent, trauma-informed care to this vulnerable population. Last year, the Office of the Inspector General released a report that documented concerning deficiencies in case manager training and skills, and ORR has commendably made significant strides to address them. So, Secretary Becerra, what changes is ORR making to improve case management standards, particularly to ensure case managers are well-trained and have relevant skills to serve unaccompanied children?
Congressman, thank you for the question because that's the core of our work. And now that we have gotten into a rhythm and figured out how to best try to make the process work, we're able to train to that. So that way we have a consistency. So no child is treated differently when it comes to having the same opportunity to be placed with a reliable, vetted sponsor. And so the training has improved. We're moving more towards, with technology, towards a faster way of trying to secure identity information about sponsors. We are providing far better care than several years ago for these kids. As you pointed out, we actually provide educational services, mental health services, things that were not provided before we started this process. And what we're doing is, while they are in our care, and it's only for a short amount of time, they are at least being provided with the safety and well-being that they need before they go off to a sponsor.
And mind you, those are the services that the Department of Homeland Securities do not provide.
That's correct.
Last year, ORR faced an unprecedented number of arrivals of unaccompanied children. Even as the arrivals have slowed, ORR has to be prepared to adjust its capacity to establish emergency housing, take on staff, and provide services to children when regular spikes in migration occur. So what has ORR learned over the past 2 years about how to respond to influxes in unaccompanied minors and how to ensure that the office continues to provide high-quality care for children when there are high numbers of children crossing the border?
Well, Congressman, one of the first things we learned is you can't wait till you see the kids coming in to try to find a safe bed, a place that they can go. You have to be ready for them. And so we are constantly making sure that we have the services available for any child who comes in. We also now work closely with the Department of Homeland Security to make sure no child is coming to us, for example, COVID positive, and then interspersed with kids who are not infected. So we segregate children so we can protect those who are not ill. And so we have spaces and beds that are specific for kids who are positive for COVID or who may have other infectious diseases or who need particular medical assistance. So we've learned through the process and we have become far more efficient. And that is the really important aspect of this, because efficiency process means the kids ultimately will be in a home where child welfare experts say they should be, not in a congregate care setting.
And in response to the Office of Inspector General's concerns, ORR also made several improvements to the UC Online portal. OIG claimed that these deficiencies in ORR software could have increased children's risk of release to unsafe sponsors. So what changes has ORR made to the UC portal, and how do these changes enhance case management and reduce risk in the placement process?
Yeah, the portal is our way to try to collect that information that helps us verify. We have kids in our care. We have to try to place them with a sponsor. How can we be assured that we're going to place them with a safe and prepared sponsor? That portal helps us collect a lot of that information to make sure that we ultimately, when we make that release, that discharge is going to be a good one for the child.
Secretary, thank you for your leadership, thank you for your concern, and thank you for making these improvements.
Thank you.
Thank you, gentleman. He yields back. Now recognize Chairwoman of the full committee, Ms. McMorris-Rogers, for 5 minutes of questioning.
Mr. Secretary, you're here today because the Office of Inspector General and other independent investigations have flagged on numerous occasions that your ORR, the Office of Refugee Resettlement, has failed to properly house and care for unaccompanied children. ORR employees and contractors have reported a, quote, pervasive sense of despair among children at the facility who reported experiencing distress and anxiety and panic attacks. In other instances, children have been physically harming themselves due to negligence. The IG's report found that, quote, ORR eliminated critical safeguards from the sponsor screening process, thereby potentially increasing children's risk of release to unsafe sponsors. I wanted to ask, can you guarantee that no child that you're responsible for keeping safe is sent to a sponsor looking to exploit their labor? Can you guarantee that? Can you say yes or no that you can guarantee ORR doesn't place children in households with convicted sex offenders or child abusers?
Madam Chair, I know you're a mom and I'm a dad. There's very few times when you can say yes or no about anything about your kids. And we've got thousands of kids in our care. And what I will tell you is that the challenge that we face to make sure that those children are properly placed is one we take very seriously. And so we do everything we can to vet those sponsors before we let those
just
children
reclaiming
go.
my time, you conducted you only conducted child abuse and neglect background checks in 9% of the cases in 2021. Are you doing these checks in 100% of the cases today, yes or no?
Madam Chair, we are doing the very thorough vetting process for any sponsor to make sure we understand who is asking for the opportunity to care for these
Okay,
children.
so my question is, are you doing 100% background checks to ensure that the children are not going into the households of convicted sex offenders or child abusers?
We do background checks on every potential sponsor. We check for criminal records of every potential sponsor.
FBI checks?
We do background checks, and the FBI usually does a lot of those for us.
I'll look forward to seeing that confirmed. You know, there's a lot of questions I have about unaccompanied minors. But I have unlimited time, and I do want to turn to the questions around reappointing the NIH officials, including Dr. Fauci, after their terms expired in December of 2021. So on May 5th, 2023, Assistant Secretary Melanie E. Gurin sent a letter to this committee stating that the Secretary appoints the directors of NIH institutes and centers, with the NIH director being the recommending official. To be clear, the letter states, quote, NIH IC directors are recommended for appointment by the NIH director and approved for appointment by the Secretary of Health and Human Services. We then received a letter last Friday, also from Secretary E. Gurin, that contradicts her May 5th letter and asserts that HHS now believes the NIH director may appoint NIH IC directors. So I'm hoping to ask a simple question, one that we first asked March of last year. Who reappointed the IC directors when their terms expired in December of 2021? Yes or no? Are you claiming then that NIH director Francis Collins signed the appointment paperwork?
Madam Chair, as we have said to you, whether in letter or orally, the appointments we have made are valid. We stand by those appointments. If you read the statute, it's very clear. The
Okay.
director
Okay.
shall be
Reclaim-
appointed by the secretary, acting through the director of the
Okay.
National Institute of Health.
Reclaiming my time, is there a form in NIH or HHS with Director Collins' signature reappointing Anthony Fauci and the rest of the IC directors? And if so, why will you not provide it to us?
Madam Chair, there's ample evidence of the process that we use. It is valid under law. The appointments we have made, we stand by them.
So, Mr. Secretary, is there a form? Is there a letter? Can you provide us any documentation that Dr. Collins reappointed these IC directors?
Although we have already provided you with a lot of information, I'm more than willing to have my
Okay.
team follow up with you on
Okay.
that particular question.
I haven't seen it yet. On June 8th, 2023, June 15th, 2023, you signed affidavits ratifying the selection and prospectively reappointing certain NIH directors. Was that the first time you signed a document related to the reappointments? Can you just say yes or no?
Again, Madam Chair, the evidence is before you,
Okay,
and it's ample. that we
okay.
have-
What evidence?
The process that we've appointed, we've answered these questions in writing. I'm saying to you again that
Yet
we
to see the
stand by these
documents. I
appointments.
have another question. Do you agree that NIH Institute and center directors qualify as inferior officers of the U.S.? Yes or no?
I'm sorry, can you repeat that
Are
question?
they inferior officers of the U.S.?
Again, Madam Chair, now, we can go into the questions of how to interpret a particular word here or there, but what I'm saying to you is that the appointments and reappointments of our personnel at NIH, our directors, was done validly.
So, Mr. Secretary, you're an attorney, you have hundreds of lawyers. Does the HHS officials believe, under the Constitution, that the NIH IC directors are inferior officers or not? That's the question I'd like to have answered.
And we believe that the process we used to appoint those NIH directors was valid.
So are they inferior officers?
Madam Chair, I can get back to you and have that conversation in more detail at some point if you want to work through
Okay.
my staff, but what I will tell you is that those
Okay.
IC directors are working
Okay.
properly because they were validly appointed and reappointed.
Send the documentation, Mr. Secretary. I'd like to ask unanimous consent to enter into the record the New York Times article entitled, "In One Flaw, Questions on Validity of 46 Judges." And I'd like to suggest that you read it. It's about 46 patent judges who were appointed by the Patent and Trademark Office and not the Secretary of Commerce, and how the Department of Justice has all but admitted the appointments were improper. The situation is similar to this one, and the article makes clear, it's well established, inferior officers must be appointed by the President or the Secretary of the agency. Unanimous consent to enter this into the record.
That will be taken up at the end of the hearing when we take up the other unanimous consent request. Thank you.
Okay, I yield back.
Gentlelady yields back. I now recognize, Mr. Peters has left. I recognize Ms. DeGette of Colorado for her 5 minutes of questioning. Oh, sorry, I did it again, sorry. Mr. Pallone has come back, and he is in order to get his questions asked. Mr. Pallone, 5 minutes of questioning.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Earlier this year, the New York Times made the claim that HHS could not reach 85,000 children after they were released from ORR care, and we've seen the media and elected officials suggest that these children have gone missing. I think that's a mischaracterization of the facts, but Mr. Secretary, I'd just like you to clarify this statistic and explain why the claim that ORR allowed these kids to go missing is inaccurate and doesn't reflect how ORR checks up on children's post-release.
Congressman, first, thank you for asking the question, because again, this is where I believe we've seen the greatest amount of misunderstanding, or perhaps better put, misinformation about the work that we do. As I've repeated over and over, we lose custodial care and responsibility for these children when we release them to the vetted sponsor. That means that our authorities to monitor, follow up, are only what the child and the sponsor want to engage with us in, and so it becomes more difficult. The references in the New York Times article are to voluntary calls that we make. 3 times we try to reach each child. 3 times separately. We try to reach each sponsor to check in, to find out how the child is doing in the transition. There is no requirement for the sponsor or the child to answer the call, and there could be any number of reasons why the children or sponsors may not answer the call. But that doesn't mean that the children are lost. And suggesting that any kind of numbers that relate to those calls show that we lost kids is categorically false.
I appreciate that, and I think you also said that ORR was able to reach the child or the sponsor in more than 81% of the households. That was my recollection.
And that's, again, they're not required to. And
Right.
we're out there trying to get to them, but they're not required to get back to us, nor the sponsors.
All right, I appreciate that. I was also pleased to see ORR entered into an agreement with the Department of Labor so that information about active Department of Labor investigations can be used to improve ORR's vetting and sponsorship process. But could you explain how has ORR integrated information from the Department of Labor into its sponsor screening process, and how does this information better equip ORR to detect and prevent trafficking?
Congressman, probably the easiest example to understand is the hotspots. If DOL is finding that there are certain hotspots in the country where child labor exploitation is occurring, if they flag that for us, that in this region, in this town, in this city of America, there are lots of employers who are unscrupulously hiring children and forcing them to do work, we can then take that information and take more care when someone applies to be a sponsor who's coming from that region. We're able now with this more formalized memorandum of agreement with the Department of Labor to actually seek actual data, not just sort of the hotspot information, but particular data, which helps us dig deeper, go more granular in trying to find out if this potential sponsor is someone we should avoid.
Thank you. Now, finally, I was appalled to see that even as the House Republicans expressed their outrage at the exploitation of unaccompanied minors post-release, Republicans on the Appropriations Subcommittee overseeing HHS funding recently voted in favor of a measure that would slash ORR funding by 60%. And, this kind of cut would have devastating impacts on ORR's ability to identify and remediate labor abuses. I think you may have already commented on this, but if you want to say anything more about the impact of a 60% cut to ORR's funding in terms of the office's ability to address child exploitation and provide care to unaccompanied minors.
Congressman, as I said, kids are kids. If it's your child or my child or anyone else's child, kids deserve our support and care. It would be impossible to do that if the cuts that are being proposed in the House Appropriations Committee were to go through. It would decimate our budget. It would make it tough for us just to provide the care while they're in our custody. I can't tell you what it would do to our efforts to try to reach out to children where we actually rely on Congress giving us some extra money so we could first do our core activity of caring for the child while they're with us. But then when we try to go out there and do more, once we release them to a sponsor, I don't see how we'd get to do any of those things.
Well, I appreciate your work to tackle these violations of children's rights and why it's so important that Congress provide our ORR with the tools it needs, including the funding, to support this vulnerable population. Thank you.
Thank you.
I yield back, Mr. Chairman.
Thank the gentleman for yielding back. Now recognize the gentleman from South Carolina, Mr. Duncan, for his 5 minutes of questioning.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Mr. Secretary, good to see you again. You clearly care about children. Have you seen The Sound of Freedom?
That's that new movie that's been put out? No, I have not.
Yes, sir. I recommend that you see it. Globally, too many children disappear every year, never to be seen from again, sold into sex trafficking and slavery.
Congressman, if I could just mention, I was former Attorney General in my state of California. I investigated, I apprehended, I arrested, and I prosecuted.
And I appreciate that work. I knew of that. I know your heart. So the movie is phenomenal. I met with the HHS or the DHS guy in Columbia in 2014 with Ed Royce. The atrocities against unaccompanied children should come as no surprise, considering who this administration and U.S. Department of Health and Human Services is hiring to care for them. Mr. Secretary, are you aware HHS recently awarded a $75 billion contract for for-profit companies that have zero child care experience?
Congressman, if you can give me details, I can try to respond to your
I'll
questions.
tell you now.
I'm not familiar with a $75
Amentum,
billion
which specializes in
contract.
aviation, environmental solutions, and engineering, and J&J Worldwide, a private equity-owned company that got its start in custodial services and facility management. What qualifications does a custodial company have to provide medical and mental health care to children who have been through extraordinary trauma?
Congressman, what I can tell you is that anyone who seeks to contract with HHS to provide services to unaccompanied children has to go through a rigorous formal process that's been established for a long time.
But
to be
do
able to
they?
secure
I
any
mean,
kind of
they're a
contract.
custodial company. What expertise do they have in vetting and assessing safe placement for children entrusted to your care?
Well, I can tell you, Congressman, that we do not contract with anyone who cannot provide the kinds of services. that we
$75
see.
billion is probably close to what we gave Ukraine. So would you hand your child over to one of these companies that has no experience in childcare? I'm not going to ask you to answer that. HHS paid Rapid Development Incorporated, another for-profit with little to no experience in childcare, $3.48 billion to care for unaccompanied minors since President Joe Biden took office. According to the company's website, Rapid Deployment specializes in wastewater treatment, electrical utilities, security operations in Iraq and Afghanistan. Your agency hired this company to operate the Fort Bliss emergency influx site, which has been widely reported as having deplorable conditions. They have also been whistleblower allegations of child abuse, a damning OIG report, and then even hired ServPro, the flood repair and mold remediation company, to be youth care workers. Mr. Secretary, do you think mold remediation specialists and utility workers should be caring for tens of thousands of children?
Congressman, all the entities, contractors that we work with have to show that they can actually do the work that's necessary to stand up facilities, to operate the facilities. And today I can tell you that we are offering more services to children than had ever been offered before, because we're able to now work with people who understand what they need to do.
A mold-free environment and great wastewater treatment sounds like what it is. I would ask the OIG to investigate these contracts, because $75 billion is a huge contract. It's not obvious to you that for-profit companies are bidding on these programs because they can be paid hundreds of millions of dollars, in some cases billions of dollars, for the work they are not qualified for, face no repercussions for doing a terrible job. Are you not concerned with the precedent your department is setting that you can harm children without consequence?
Congressman, as I said, we go through an established process for anyone who wishes to work with the federal government, and especially if they're going to work in an area that has migrant and or minor children. And so the work that we do is very challenging, and it's very important to do it right. And so the contractors that we employ, whether it's to stand up a facility or to actually operate it, go through a significant vetting process to be able to qualify.
I'm going to send a letter. I'm going to talk to the chairman to try to get OIG to investigate these contracts. I would ask you, Mr. Secretary, to look into that, and I'm asking you today, after you look into it, to get back with me in my office about the services these company provides, if there's any irregularities, any calls for alarm, because we both have heart for the children. I want to make sure they're taken care of. I'm also concerned about children released in the country, as the chairman mentioned earlier, without tying in that familiar relationship, because I'm worried about where these children end up. Even in this country, when we have sex trafficking, every major sporting event has prostitution. I'm sure children in sex slave trade here in this country. I want to make sure that children that are sent here by their parents from these triangle countries or Latin American countries that make their way north, tens of thousands of dollars paid by those parents to send them north, and those children aren't entering the sex or the slave trade. And I look forward to your response on that. Now yield back.
Gentleman yields back. And now I recognize Mr. Peters, the gentleman of California, for his 5 minutes of questioning.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Thanks for the hearing. And thank you, Mr. Secretary, for coming. It's great that you're here. In your testimony, you note that the various challenges ORR faces in providing high-quality care for unaccompanied children calls for a whole-of-government approach. And for example, we heard about ORR's partnership with the Department of Labor to address trafficking, and I know that ORR works with state governments, including my home state of California, our home state of California, to resettle refugees and provide them with services. And I want to make sure that we continue to support this effort so that it's, the coordination remains helpful and productive. So, Mr. Secretary, can you tell us how ORR is working to improve cooperation with state and local governments? I think this came up a little bit before, but particularly with respect to connecting children with post-release services?
Congressman, thank you for the question, and I want to salute the folks in our state of California for their cooperation at the local level to work with us. When we had to stand up under very difficult and emergent circumstances back in 2021, facilities to be able to provide shelter and beds for children, we were able to work with the city of Long Beach, the county of Los Angeles, with the city of San Diego to stand up facilities. We had no choice but to use convention centers. We turned convention centers into a place for children to sleep, eat, get their care. All those things were done with the strong cooperation of the local leadership in those cities and counties. That's what we continue to do with, once we have released a child to a vetted sponsor, where we can, as we've heard, we try to do post-release services. Sometimes we coordinate, we work closely with the local government services that are there, and we will do everything we can to make sure that we're working closely with our partners at the city, county, and state level.
Thank you. I know Mayor Gloria appreciated the work of the federal government in that instance, and it was great we could all come together and use that asset, which, you know, sadly wasn't being used for conventions. It was a really smart thing to do at the time. But I guess not all states probably are working as productively with ORR, and some states refusing to license ORR facilities in their states. When a state refuses to collaborate, you know, what's the other side of that? How are children hurt? What is ORR doing to support children in states where you don't maybe have the same kind of partnership?
Yeah, we've had a couple of circumstances where a couple of states have actually try to de-license facilities that we use to provide care. We seek facilities that are going to care for these children while we have them in our custody that are licensed, that have gone through the process to receive a state license to actually offer care to children. We don't just care for these kids in a facility without people who are trained. Licensed care facilities we use where we can. And believe it or not, there are some states that are trying to prevent us from actually providing the care for these unaccompanied children through licensed facilities. It obviously harms the children if we can't try to protect them by having people who've gone through the licensing process. But what we've done is decide if they're going to shirk their responsibility, we're going to do what you would expect, which is to make sure that we abide by those standards that would be required of any facility that did get a license.
Children can arrive with complicated pre-existing conditions, some which may be fatal, as unfortunately has been the case a few times this year. What do you do to ensure that all children in OR's care have access to high-quality medical care? And again, this is something you talked about a little bit in terms of your ability to follow up under the current law.
Yeah, and that's where these licensed care facilities are so important, because they don't get a license unless they can provide that level of service, and in some cases, healthcare, medical services. We make sure that children receive the services that you would expect of any child. As I keep saying, kids are kids. We're going to treat them like your kid, my kid, anyone's kid. Children should not have to go through the trauma of being mistreated simply because people don't know who they are, have they not been around for a long time. And so we will provide whatever health care is available, both through our facility, and sometimes, as you mentioned, we actually send them to medical facilities in the surrounding area. Oftentimes, we have had kids who come with pre-existing medical conditions, and we have had circumstances where we have had children who are terminally ill come to our care.
Mr. Chairman, you remember, Mr. Secretary, you remember the clock here. I'm running out of time, but I just want to say that I think everyone here understands that OR has a heavy responsibility to these children. I want to thank you for exercising the leverage of partnerships with states, localities, local organizations to make sure that we do take as good a care of these kids as we can. Thank you for your hard work, and if we can be helpful, let us know. I yield back.
And thank you to you when we were in San Diego with those facilities.
Gentleman yields back, and now recognize the gentleman from Alabama, Mr. Palmer, for his 5 minutes of questioning.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Secretary Becerra, I hate to do this, but I have some concerns about your testimony based on testimony you gave in another hearing held April 27, 2022, before the Energy and Commerce Health Subcommittee. And in that hearing, I asked you about a final rule that included a provision that will provide financial incentive for doctors to create and implement an anti-racism plan. And
Congressman, I'm having a very difficult time hearing you.
I said that I asked you a question about a provision in a final rule that would provide an incentive for doctors to create and implement an anti-racism plan, and your response was that we don't have a policy as you described. The testimony is before you, underlined and highlighted, and you went on to say this, and you've used these words multiple times thus far in this hearing. You said much of this is driven by myths and disinformation. You said, I would challenge you to show me where in our policies we call anything we are doing anti-racism policies. The very next day, in a Ways and Means Committee hearing, Ranking Member Jason Smith, now Chairman Jason Smith, asked you basically the same question, and you responded, and in my opinion, rather dismissively, that no such plan existed, and you said, I think it's unfortunate that too much misinformation and disinformation is put out there on what's being done. That's what confuses Americans. Chairman Smith and I submitted a letter to you pointing this out, and we pointed out that that you said that HHS does not have a policy as I think were referring to me, described, and that much of this is driven by mis and disinformation. One day later at the Ways and Means Committee, you gave the same response to Smith's questions. You responded to Chairman Smith's letter. You did not respond to me. And at the bottom of that page, the create and implement an anti-racism plan improvement activity, IAAHE 8, which was adopted through notice and comment. I've also provided the cover page for the rule that was dated November 19th, 2021, more than 5 months, or right out 5 months before that hearing before the Energy and Commerce Committee. And I've also provided you with the section in it under the proposed activity title. Would you read that?
You'd like me to read what?
The year and future years, it's clipped together there. It should be about the second group of documents there. I'll read it for you. The proposed activity titles create and implement an anti-racism plan. And in the proposed activity description, it says an understanding of race as a political and social construct, not as a physiological one. And then the final action, after consideration of the public comments received, we're finalizing this activity as proposed. Now, that's very problematic for me because I was very deferential to you in that hearing, and you commented on that. It's in the transcript. And I expected an honest answer. And I'm not saying you didn't give an honest answer, because if you answered truthfully, that means you did not know what was going on in your own agency. So what I want to know today, Mr. Secretary, is did you answer honestly, or were you uninformed 5 months after this rule was submitted?
Congressman Palmer, first, let me thank you for the way you've posed the question, and thank you for the information you have before me. I can guarantee you that when I answered your questions, I answered them honestly, to the best of my knowledge. If you're providing me with information that shows some inconsistency in what I may have said, I'll take a look at this and try to get back to you. But first and foremost, I owe you that because of the way you respectfully asked the questions, and I will try to, as respectfully, respond back to your questions.
Well, you've served in Congress, you've served as an Attorney General.
Yes, sir.
And I take this very seriously.
I appreciate that.
And what prompted this is the constant reference to disinformation and misinformation. We're very concerned about the well-being of these children. And we have evidence that things aren't as well as maybe you think they are. And I want to get to the bottom of this, but I also want to make sure that when any member of any administration, Republican or Democrat, comes before Congress, takes an oath to give truthful testimony, that that's exactly what we get. Now, Mr. Secretary, I'm going to enter this into the record, and we'll follow up on this later. I respect you and your willingness to respond back to us and clarify the record. With that, Mr. Chairman, I yield back. And I would like to enter these documents into the record.
And we will take that up at the end of the hearing. I assume you provided that to our staff so they can provide it to the Democrats as well.
Congressman Palmer, thank you very much.
Thank you, Mr. Secretary.
Thank the gentleman. He yields back. Now recognize gentlelady from Colorado, Ms. DeGette, for her 5
Thank you
minutes.
so much, Mr. Chairman. Mr. Secretary, it's great seeing you, and thank you for coming over today. I've been working on these ORR issues for a long time, as you know, and frankly, your agency and the Biden administration in general inherited a terrible immigration crisis, and particularly kids that came across the border under the Trump policies of separation of families really are, I want to talk about that in a minute with you, but they've been really devastating, and your agency has been forced to sort of try to put it all back together on a real-time basis. So I just want to ask a couple questions. The first thing that happens, an unaccompanied minor comes across the border, and immediately they're placed in ORR's care. After they come, within 72 hours, I think, right?
They actually go into care at CBP,
Right.
and then they process them, and
And then they put them into your care.
and they are required to try to do that within 72 hours.
That's correct. So then the next thing that happens is the agency attempts to find relatives or other people in which to put the kids' custody. Is that right?
That's correct.
And that happens with most of these kids. Is that correct?
All of the kids. We make
No,
an
I mean, you don't find relatives of all of the kids.
the vast majority we do, but not all.
That's correct. And so then you have a process. If you, and most of the kids are placed quickly, but not all of them, right?
That's correct.
And so the ones that are, this is where, so for the small percentage where you don't immediately find somebody, this is where you take them into custody and you put them in these certified facilities, and then you try to find an appropriate place to put these kids. Is that right?
That's correct. And over, we're looking for sponsors.
Right. So then these kids are placed, and then there are these voluntary follow-up calls that are made to these families. Is that right?
That's correct.
But under law, the families aren't required to respond to that, are they?
Unfortunately, that's correct.
Right. So when you're looking for these placements, this is where you were telling my colleagues, you do the background checks, you check out the homes, you do the home inspections where necessary. Is that right?
That's correct.
Now, and by the way, you don't have the ability legally to take these kids back into custody if there's some kind of a problem. Is that right?
That is correct.
So all of this process it's costly, and it takes a lot of money, doesn't it?
Absolutely.
So if we were to cut ORR, so we're all concerned about these kids, and I do believe my colleagues on the other side of the aisle, they're all parents too. We do care about these kids, but you can't do something with nothing. So if you cut the budget of ORR by 60%, I would say it'd be kind of hard to do all of those procedures that you just delineated for me. Would that be right?
Not just hard, impossible.
Right. You couldn't do the background checks. You couldn't run your certified centers. You couldn't do the home inspections. You couldn't do any of that for anybody, right?
It'd be near impossible to do it.
So you don't have to answer this, but it seems to me if everybody was so concerned about these children, they would increase your budget so you could do a more thorough investigation, so you could have better care for these kids, and so that you could really serve them right.
Children are children. We owe them care.
Right. Okay. I just want to get a quick report. I'm running out of time, but we still, in May of this year, we still had 868 kids from the previous Trump administration separation of families that we had not found their loved ones. They hadn't been reunified. And it's getting harder and harder as time goes by because many of those parents have gone back to their home countries. Do you have a status report for me on what's going on with that?
Congressman, we can follow up with you. Most of that activity is handled by the Department of Homeland Security, but we work with them when they are children, minor children.
Okay, if you can get back to me, that would be great. I kind of want to know how many of those 868 kids we have found their families, and then what we're continuing to do about the rest of them. We had a lot, I was the chair of this subcommittee then, and we had a lot of hearings on it. It was just heartbreaking to see what the Trump administration did to those families. Thank you, and I yield back.
Thank you.
Gentlelady yields back. Now recognize the vice chair of the subcommittee, Ms. Lesko from Arizona.
Thank you,
5
Mr.
minutes.
Chair. Thank you, Secretary. Secretary Becerra, I have the requirements here. Needed to become a foster parent for dogs and cats through City Dogs and City Kitties Rescue in DC. All the people who want to take a dog or cat into their home need to fill out an application, are interviewed by the rescue shelter, and their home is inspected. Mr. Becerra, does ORR inspect the homes of 100% of the prospective UC sponsors?
Congresswoman, thank you for the question.
Yes or no, please? 100%. Do you inspect the homes of the UC sponsors?
We do a thorough vetting process of any sponsor.
Do you, yes or no? 100% of the UC sponsors, sir. Do you inspect the homes of the unaccompanied children proposed sponsors?
We will often do home studies of.
Well,
some of
I
the
guess that's a no.
prospective Sponsors.
If you don't, which I assume you don't since you didn't answer yes or no, why is it that dogs and cats that are being foster parent in DC homes get a more thorough vetting and their homes are inspected, and not the sponsors of unaccompanied children being put into homes?
Congresswoman, we do a thorough vetting process that
Do
includes.
you inspect all of the homes?
We do a thorough vetting process of the individual.
You're not answering. Okay, my next question is, in Arizona, an individual seeking to become a foster adoptive parent and all adults living in that same household must pass an FBI and local criminal background check and have a level 1 fingerprint clearance card issued by the Department of Public Safety. What percentage of sponsors have completed FBI background checks?
Every person who wishes to become a sponsor goes through background checks before they can participate in our.
What percentage have passed a FBI background check?
There are any number of background checks that they go through. It could include
You're not answering
fingerprinting
again.
or
What
DNA
percentage of
voluntary DNA
sponsors have
testing.
undergone sexual offender registry checks?
We do sexual offender checks on anyone who wishes to be a sponsor.
100%.
That is one of the checks that we do.
100% on all the sponsors.
Any
That's my
person who
question.
wishes to be a sponsor has to go through these background checks.
So 100%. Is your testimony that 100% of the prospective sponsors get a background check on the FBI background check, the sexual offender registry check?
I've answered the question, but I'll say it once again.
You have not answered the question, sir.
So, Congresswoman, I have answered your question, but I will say it again. Every person who wishes to become a sponsor must go through a background check. It could include fingerprinting, it could include voluntary DNA testing, but it certainly includes things like a sexual offender check.
It includes it. But you have not answered if 100% of the sponsors are required to pass an FBI background check and a sexual abuse and child abuse neglect registry check.
My written testimony lists all the things we do to go through the vetting process. If you would like to follow up with further detail, more granular.
No, I'd like you to answer the
can follow
question
up
if
with-
100% of the sponsors have to pass an FBI background check.
And as I've said, Congresswoman.
Just say
every
yes or
person-
no. That would be simpler, wouldn't it?
I'm answering the question, and
No, you
the
haven't.
answer is that we make sure that every person who wishes to apply to be a sponsor must go through a rigorous set of tests, including a background check.
Well, you haven't said if they have to do an FBI background check. You haven't said if 100% of them have to do a sexual abuse or child abuse and neglect registry check, as is required in Arizona for foster parents. I mean, so why is it that ORR has different standards for checking than Arizona does for vetting foster parents? Is it because they're unaccompanied children, because they're illegal immigrants? What is the reason?
And Congresswoman, that is an excellent question, because you're equating the program we have with a foster care program, and that's the crux of the problem. We don't have the same authorities that a foster care program has in your state. We cannot track these kids the way you might want to track.
I didn't say about tracking the kids. I'm talking about vetting the sponsors.
It's the same process. In order to place someone in
You do
foster
have the
care,
authority.
that individual, that adult has to go through a process. We don't have the same authorities
Mr.
that states have.
Becerra, if you are vetting these sponsors so great, how come according to the Florida statewide grand jury documents, one single family in Austin, Texas, had more than 100 children sent to it by ORR? Another Texas address had 44 children. A third had 25. In Pennsylvania, one caseworker told the Times he went to check on a child released to a man who had applied to sponsor 20 other minors. I do not think that you are doing an adequate job, and with that, I yield back.
Gentlelady yields back. Now recognize Ms. Schakowsky of Illinois for her 5 minutes of questioning.
Oh, there it is. Thank you. Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Thank you so much, Secretary, for being here today. And I'm just amazed at the attack that you're experiencing from the Republicans right now, who actually, if you know, we're talking about protecting these immigrant children, and yet Republicans want to cut funding for the Office of Refugee Resettlement by $3.3 billion, nearly a 60% cut. So at the same time, they want to harangue you about what you're doing and what you're not doing, and yet seeing an incredible cut. I'm just absolutely appalled, even in light of these horrendous allegations of corporations that are exploiting these unaccompanied children. And I don't see where the Republicans are doing any favors to these children when we talk about such an enormous cut. So I wanted to ask you, what are the implications of these cuts in funding for ORR, and what is this actually going to do to the children that they are saying in that the name of this hearing is Stopping Exploitation of Migrant Children. And I just don't see how it happens when you have a big cut like that, but you tell me.
Well, Congressman, there is no way we could sustain that level of cut. The care and well-being of children, you can't do it on the cheap. You have to provide them with appropriate services. We would certainly have to let go of services that are not required by law, such as most of our follow-up care that we try to provide after we have released a child to a vetted sponsor. So those follow-up calls, the efforts to try to reach out to people, that would be near impossible to do with the level of cuts that the House is proposing. But I think that those cuts would also undermine our ability to provide care while the kids are in our custody. There's just no way we could sustain that level of cuts.
Well, let me just say, we've been dealing with this issue, you've been dealing with this issue for a long time. If we are going to be able to move forward in actually addressing this ongoing problem, which in many ways has been created, some of it we can't help, and some of it we have, our very Congress itself has exacerbated. But certainly cuts, I just don't understand. Unfortunately, I was at another hearing as the ranking member of that subcommittee. I couldn't be here. But I don't understand the rationale when we're talking about trying to protect these children and saying, well, the way that we're going to do it is to have a nearly 60% cut in the funding that we're going to do this. Not having been here, I'm wondering if there's anything else that you wanted to add in the last minute or so that I have to set the record straight.
Congresswoman, first, thank you very much for that opportunity. I think you said it well. We have, over the last 2 years, been able to stabilize a very challenging process of caring for kids who oftentimes, as you know, are coming with trauma. The experience is harrowing oftentimes. And many of these kids have come facing abuse. And trying to provide them with the care while they're waiting to go through their immigration proceedings is not easy, and it's not cheap. There is no way that we could do the job that everyone here says that they expect if we are decimated in our funding for that program. That is for kids. This is a program that is for kids. And so I hope people understand. And if they wish us to do more work, even after we have placed them with a vetted sponsor, then I would urge them to issue legislation, introduce legislation that changes the authorities, because we don't have authorities that help us try to deal with some of the things that people are accusing ORR of not doing. We make an effort on our own voluntarily to reach out to children, even though they are not required to respond back. It would be helpful if we had the right resources and the right authorities so we can all feel more comfortable about how unaccompanied children are treated. And I hope, just the way we're doing a hearing about HHS and ORR's work with unaccompanied kids, that the chairman will issue an order to have a hearing with those employers who have exploited children to come and testify here to you and explain why they are breaking the law and making kids do dangerous work.
Thank you. I appreciate that, and I yield back.
Thank you. Now I call on Representative Crenshaw for 5 minutes of questions.
Thank you, Madam Chair. I just want to recognize right off the bat, y'all have an impossible job. Maybe it'd be helpful for my colleagues on the other side of the aisle who keep vilifying the last administration to recognize that this is an impossible job. So I'm going to remain intellectually consistent, unlike my colleagues, and recognize that this is an impossible job. What makes it a lot more impossible is when there's a lot more unaccompanied minors coming over the border. If we're looking at fiscal years 2020 versus 2021, there was an 8-fold increase in unaccompanied minors coming across the border. It went from 15,000 to 122,000. And that wasn't some random occurrence because of COVID. That number has remained, actually increased in FY22 to 128,000, and in FY23, it is on track to again be at another 120,000. Wouldn't you agree? Wouldn't we rather live in a world where ORR is not required? It's basically this giant orphanage for people coming across, for children coming across our border. It would be better if it didn't have to exist. Of course, it does have to exist, but it would be better if it didn't, right?
Congressman, we face the prospect of having to provide the care, and we're going to do what we can.
Of course, but wouldn't you rather live in a world where you didn't even have to do that? Is it better for children or worse for children to go across an international border unaccompanied?
Of course it's worse.
Of course it's worse. Of course it's worse. So when we have an 8-fold increase, it not only makes your job ever more impossible than it already was, it's a humanitarian crisis. I can't imagine what changed between the years 2020 and 2021. Does anybody have any, there was an election, right, and a lot of policy changes that created a magnet for unaccompanied minors to come across. And then all of these problems we're talking about with sponsorship and intake and trying to vet sponsors and child labor and sex trafficking, they become exponentially worse because there's an 8-fold increase in the number of kids actually coming across. So how about that? You guys are just trying to deal with it. I get that. I'm not going to vilify you the way my Democrat colleagues vilified your predecessors in the last administration, but I do have some specific questions just to help the kids through this about your policies. I was looking for some policy guidance on what to do when they go missing. It was actually much easier to find your LGBT guidance. This concerned me a little bit, maybe a lot a bit. The guidance says this: when making housing assignments for transgender or intersex youth, the care provider must consider the youth's gender self-identification. Care providers must not base housing assignment decisions of transgender or intersex youth solely on the identity documents or physical anatomy of the youth. So I want to just provide the following scenario. There's a 17-year-old boy, and I know you guys separate them by gender normally, right? I hope so. There's a 17-year-old boy tells you all that he's a girl, does he automatically just get placed into the women's facilities? Is that how that process works?
Congressman, thanks for the question. At HHS, we have a legal obligation, a moral obligation as well, to safely and humanely care for all the.
Is that how the process works? Come on, I'm being really good faith. I'm acting in good faith with you. I hope that's not how the process works, right? Because 72% of the people that come across UACs are actually 15 and older. I mean, you can barely describe them as children.
And so we make sure that we provide all the children in our care with the human rights protections and freedom from discrimination and abuse that they're entitled
Right,
to.
so it is how that works. It shouldn't work that way, all right? That's at least one member of Congress telling you it should not work that way. It puts girls in danger, and I bet a lot of the girls are younger in age. All right, I want to move on to a couple other things. There was something you said in your testimony that the sponsors are not required to answer your calls when you do that follow-up. Whose rule is that? Is that HHS's rule? Is that a statute? Why can't we make them answer the phone? And if they don't, why can't you send Child Protective Services after them?
Congressman, thank you for that question. We do not have the authority to require them to respond to us.
That doesn't, why not? Okay, so that needs to be a statute change.
That's a question you have to ask yourself.
Okay, that's a statute change that needs to happen?
That's
okay,
right.
That's helpful. Gang affiliate, I'm out of time. Well, actually, could you respond to my colleague's previous question about how do these kind of cases happen? They were talking about in Austin where one sponsor could request and like 20 different kids time and time again. This one had 44 children. Please explain how that happens, and I yield back.
I'm not familiar with that circumstance, but every sponsor has to go through a thorough vetting process, and anyone who has a flag of having tried to sponsor 43 previous kids would certainly be flagged.
I would hope so. I yield back. I'm out of time.
Gentleman yields back. Now recognize the gentleman. Nope. From. Oh, he's a wave on. Okay. All right. Sorry. Recognize the Mr. Armstrong for his 5 minutes of questioning.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. We've heard testimony in numerous different committees, and one of the things I think that is pretty much any Border Patrol agent that we have heard and wherever we're at is that the cartels are in operational control of the entire northern third of Mexico. And this Congress, we have received testimony in the Oversight Committee from Border Patrol that every person who reaches the southern border essentially at this point has had to deal with the cartels at some point in time.
If the gentleman could speak up.
It has had to deal with the cartels at some point in time. You don't have any reason to disagree with that statement, do you?
Congressman, I wouldn't have the details, but the Department of Homeland Security could probably give you a better answer to that.
And, this isn't a gotcha question, but this is one of the problems that we run into. And earlier you said that we do everything we can to ensure that these unaccompanied minors are not subjected to child labor even after we lose care, custody, and control. The problem is, whether it's statutory, and there's been a lot of talk about it, everything you can is not much.
That's correct.
But what you do have control over is the intake. And when they get into your custody. And if you have 128,000, which Mr. Crenshaw was just talking about, up from 15,000, and we know that at the very least, the vast majority of those unaccompanied minors that are getting to the border have to deal with the cartels on their way to get there. And 70+% are over the age of 15. What is your intake process? I mean, this is a high-risk group of people. The cartels are not doing this out of the goodness of their heart. You have a 16-year-old boy, 16-year-old girl getting to the border. They have family wherever it is, El Salvador, Mexico, somewhere else. There is some semblance of an arrangement in which the cartels get there. And that's before we talk about sex abuse, physical abuse, all of the other horrors that exist when they get there. So if we know you lose operational control after you place them through all the vetting, which there's been a lot of talk at. What is your intake process for these high-risk kids that do not want to tell you the truth? They are absolutely terrified of what will happen to them or their families if they actually do engage you in a real meaningful conversation.
Congressman, thank you for the question because you pointed out some of the real challenges that we face. I'm going to leave the questions about the background of the children to the Department of Homeland Security because they do that initial assessment of the child when they encountered the child.
And that's okay, but it's actually not okay. But if that's the policy, that should change, because you have them for a very specific period of time, and you have them in custody, and we know, and we can talk to anybody who has been on the southern border, that the vast majority of those children that are coming to the border, and not all 17-year-olds are created equally. If you grew up in the streets of El Salvador at 17 years old, you've had a pretty hard life already. But I don't want to talk about that part of it. I want to talk about the ones that exist in this space where we have a finite amount of time to deal with whatever metrics that are going on in their life that got them to that border. And so whatever the background is before, what do you do for an intake? How do you do a sexual assault intake?
Right, and we do a pretty thorough assessment on intake as well, but what I wanted to do is distinguish between an intake that deals with security, any issues of criminal background, versus ours, which is more on the health side.
Yeah, I'm more worried about I'm worried about the health and welfare of the kid you get. We'll deal with the other stuff later, because that exists in a real meaningful way.
Gotcha.
We know there are kids that are getting tattoos once they get to Mexico, or once they get to the United States and before we get there. That's a whole different issue. But I'm talking about this intake because from all of your testimony today, you have very limited abilities to deal with any of this after they leave your facilities. So what are we doing when they're there?
So the assessments that we're doing are on their status, their health status, on their situation in terms of who could care for them, because we only hold them temporarily. And so our assessments, unlike a DHS's assessments, are for purposes of understanding the status, the well-being of the children. So we do intake, we do clinical assessments, we do case reviews, we do an assessment of any child. We use professionals in child welfare to understand who is coming into our door and who we're caring for. And then we continue the process during the case management to figure out if that child can be placed.
Okay, then I'm going to ask a very specific question because I have 22 seconds left. You went up from 15,000 to 128,000. What is the difference in numbers of kids that you identify as being trafficked in some way, either for labor, sexual assault, physical assault, anything that has gone up? Because the other thing that's gone up with that number is the number of those kids who have to deal with the cartels in order to get into your facility.
Yeah. So again, Department of Homeland Security would be doing that initial check to find out if this is a child who's coming in with a trafficking background. We also, if we make an assessment and find that the child may have experienced trafficking, we also then do an assessment, and we provide actually additional services by law, by the way, that's in the statute, that we provide additional service for any child that we get into our care who we get information that they may have been trafficked in advance. And so we're able to provide them more service.
But a 16-year-old girl who's been threatened with her parents getting killed, if they talk to you and then you have them for a finite period of time and kick them out, and for whatever reason, I mean, we know this is happening. What are the increased numbers in trafficked kids comparative to the numbers?
I don't have the specific numbers. I can try to make sure my team gets back to you with
We
any
would like to
information
see
we have.
those. I yield back.
Gentleman yields back. Now recognize the gentlelady from Florida, Ms. Kamick, for 5 minutes of questioning.
Thank you, Secretary Becerra. I want to start with your attention here on this jar. Do you see this? Do you know what this is?
Looks like candies or snacks.
Unfortunately, the reality is much more grim. These are wristbands that the cartels force people to wear when they cross the border. And if you're not wearing one and you cross the border, the cartels will take a limb or an appendage. This is what these people are forced to wear, and it dictates what cartel they belong to, how much they have paid. And they are absolutely a part of the horrors of trafficking and smuggling that occurs at our southwest border. And I have to point this out because I want to tell the journey, because this has really been laid out in bits and pieces along the way by my colleagues, and we're here to talk about these kids. So if you could turn your attention to the screen real fast, I want to show a quick photo that I took. It was 11:46 at night. I myself took this photo. That little girl that you see was acting terrified, not of the agents, not of myself, but of the man holding her. The very next day at the Donna Processing Facility, we threatened, and I was there to witness this man with a DNA test. He confessed that he actually was not her father, that he had rented her. This is a process called recycling. Now, I know we're here to talk about what happens to these kids after this point, But this little girl was then turned over to HHS custody, your custody. And you've talked at length today about the vetting process, right? And so you now know that this little girl, not through a DNA test, she's not related to that man. She now is in your custody. You have your own case managers who are supposed to vet these processes. And we, of course, know this from the Florida grand jury. These case managers have very little training or no training in interviewing these individuals, particularly children and young children who have been traumatized. You can imagine this man who you just saw on the screen, who, by the way, was a convicted sex offender with this child. You can imagine the trauma that that child had sustained. Your own case managers are not trained in examining, evaluating, or recognizing documents as authentic or fake. She came with no documents. They have no official training when it comes to trauma-informed interviewing skills, no official training when it comes to investigating the safety or legitimacy of addresses to which a UAC may be sent. Now, I don't know what happened to that little girl, but what I do know is that the sponsors that you claim to thoroughly vet, which I would love to get your definition of thorough, because you haven't been able to articulate that here today. It also would include the fact that these kids show up with numbers pinned to their clothes or Sharpied on their bodies to call. Agents have reported in official testimony that these kids have the numbers, the same phone number Sharpied on their arms time and time again. Now, we've heard, of course, of situations where the same sponsor is being called, and magically 20, 30, 40 kids end up with that sponsor. And again, I go back to your statement of we thoroughly vet. You've really emphasized that. Do you vet every member of the household? And does it include an FBI check? Does it include an Interpol check? I would hope that it would, considering that we've had 151 different nationalities cross the southwest border under the Biden administration. But I'm guessing that it doesn't, because only 9% of the UACs are subjected to a DNA test with their sponsor, less than 23% to a background check. And again, I should point out for the record the fact that you release these folks, these kids, to sponsors that are in the country illegally. By definition, they have already broken the law. Is it a standard operating policy to release children into the hands of sponsors in households that haven't been properly vetted and that are here in the country illegally?
I think I heard a question there, and so I'll try to respond because you packed a lot in there, a lot which I think has a lot of misinformation and that I disagree with. I could first start by saying that we do go through a thorough process on assessment of the child when the child first comes to our attention. So that
What
little
is your
girl,
I'm sorry, I'm going to reclaim my time. Secretary, what is your definition of thorough?
I mentioned it in a previous
Does it include
response.
a DNA test?
An assessment of the child's
No, that is not my
situation.
question. My question is, does it include a DNA test, yes or no?
DNA is one of the tools that we use on occasion.
In only 9% of the cases. Does it
It is
include a
tool that
background
we
check?
use. We do a number of things to go through a series of tests and assessments of a child when we get them. We do
And a
the same
background
type
check
of
in
vetting.
only 23% of the cases? And the DNA, by the way, that you rely on in your ORR case managers, if you could please pull up Exhibit 2. This shows that the DNA requirements that you rely on in the case files, I realize this is a CBP document, but this memo is something that is really important for what we're talking about, because so much of the case files that your case managers rely on in vetting these thorough checks, they've suspended the DNA requirement. I'm out of time. I know you want to answer the question anyway and deviate from your carefully crafted talking points, but I think this is disgusting that 85,000 children are missing, and it's on your watch. With that, I yield
Kenley
back.
yields back. Now recognize the gentleman from North Carolina, Mr. Hudson, for his 5 minutes of questioning.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and thank you, Mr. Secretary, for being here today. On President Joe Biden's first day in office, dozens of President Donald Trump's common sense policies maintaining our southern border were reversed. Policies like Remain in Mexico, Safe Third Country, Title 42, and border construction was stopped even though the contracts were paid. President Biden and Secretary Mayorkas' open border policies have created a national security and a humanitarian crisis. As a father of a second grader and congressman of the largest military installation in the country, it is heartbreaking and frustrating to see this rapid decline in border security. This administration's open border policies have not only affected our nation's border communities, but all communities, including those in North Carolina. Because of the reversals of these policies, your agency has been overwhelmed. So the decision was made to weaken vetting procedures for sponsors at the expense of the safety of unaccompanied minors and the communities across our nation. As we saw in an investigative report, HHS has undone safeguards in place to make sure children are placed with safe sponsors. The result has been over 85,000 lost children, untold numbers of whom have fallen victim to sex and labor trafficking. Mr. Secretary, you previously sat before me at a health subcommittee hearing on May 12th, 2021. I asked you point blank if you were planning on sending unaccompanied minors to North Carolina. You told me, quote, "There is no plan that we have to shelter children in North Carolina," end quote. But your staff has since informed me that the Office of Refugee Resettlement conducted an initial site visit at the American Hebrew Academy in Greensboro, North Carolina on April 22nd, 3 weeks before your testimony, and that your people actually conducted a full formal site assessment on May 12th, the day of your testimony. Your folks were on the ground in North Carolina. Mr. Secretary, it sure sounds like there was a plan to shelter unaccompanied minors in North Carolina. So when I asked you on that day over 2 years ago, how would you characterize your answer to me? Were you intentionally lying to me and the people of North Carolina, or would you say you were carefully choosing your words to mislead me? Would you say you were being clever? What word would you use to describe your answer to me that day?
Congressman, thank you for the question, and I hope you'll understand my answer. I was completely honest with you because you asked me if we were planning to send kids to North Carolina. 2 years ago, we didn't have a facility there that we would be sending kids to North Carolina. We go through the constant process, as you probably heard. We look for sites all over the country. We are in 27 states. We're constantly looking for sites. Today, we are looking at a particular site in Greensboro, and that is the absolute truth. So what I said to you then was accurate. What I'm saying to you now, I hope you'll understand, will be accurate as well.
Well, on the day you said there are no plans, your people were doing a formal second site visit in North Carolina.
Congressman, you have to understand the process. We put out a word, we're looking for potential sites. We have no idea what's going to come in. Everyone has an opportunity, because we have an open process. Everyone has a chance to show us if they have a good site. At that point in time, we had no idea if there would be a particular site in Greensboro that we could use. There might have been interest, but we still, 2 years later, and we still don't have an open site.
So were you carefully using the word plan? We don't have a plan to try to trick me?
No, I was trying to be honest with you. If you ask me about where we are right now with any particular site in Greensboro, I'll give you the details that I can give you today with what I know. But I can't predict, I couldn't have predicted 2 years ago where we would be today. And we still don't have a particular center open in Greensboro, North Carolina.
Okay, we'll agree to disagree on that. But speaking of that, I want to know why we even need this facility in North Carolina. There are 2 influx care facilities in Texas that were placed in warm status, meaning there was no unaccompanied minors in care and minimal facility management services on site. Your staff tells me they plan to move the Greensboro influx care facility into warm status next month. To me, this sounds like your department may be wasting taxpayer dollars on 2 empty facilities in Texas and plan to open yet another one in North Carolina. Mr. Secretary, if 2 facilities in Texas were moved down to warm status, what factors, though, are using to move the Greensboro facility up to warm status? How are you using the same factors to justify 2 contradictory actions?
Congressman, fair question. One of the sites, for example, Fort Bliss, is a military installation. We were able, 2021, when we needed to find places, we essentially stood up a site for kids. But Fort Bliss is not supposed to be a place where you care for kids. We're looking for a more permanent site that is more amenable, accommodating to children. And that's where we put out the call from all over the country. One of those sites that may ultimately go online is in Greensboro, because it is going to be one that we have actually stood up to provide for services to kids, not a military installation.
Okay, well, I'm out of time, but I believe when I asked you 2 years ago, do you have any plans to put children in North Carolina, to be honest with me, rather than saying, well, we don't have a plan, you should have said what you said today, which is we're looking everywhere. We are looking at a site. In fact, my people on the ground today in North Carolina looking. It's possible mean, that would have been a more complete, honest answer, I think.
Congressman, you've approached this in a very respectful way, and I hope I can say this respectfully to you. I hope that you'll find as we develop the relationship, and I hope a friendship, that I will try to be as honest with you as I can.
Well, I look forward to that. Thank you, and I yield
Gentleman
back.
yields back. Now recognize the gentleman from California, Mr. Cardenas, for his 5 minutes of question.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Appreciate this opportunity to have this discussion and this public discussion on this very, very important issue. Mr. Secretary, you've inherited a deeply challenging task, and on the heels of the Trump administration's egregious and inhumane family separation policy, you're charged with protecting kids who are increasingly exploited and forced into child labor by U.S. corporations, being forced to work with unsafe machinery and hazardous materials, risking literally life and limb. All of this because of lackluster approach to protecting children by some of my Republican colleagues and the twice impeached president who routinely vilified and mistreated immigrants. Let me be clear, child labor is child abuse, and this needs a strong legislative response at every level. Unfortunately, current child labor protections do not go nearly far enough to deter child exploitations. Corporations, U.S. corporations, find ways to shield themselves from liability by employing third-party contractors, for example. This deserves all of our attention. We need solutions designed to protect children. Meanwhile, child labor laws are being systematically weakened by many Republican legislators at the state level. For example, in at least 10 states, legislation has been proposed to roll back modest child labor protections in an attempt to enable multi-billion-dollar corporations to exploit children right here in America. Immigrant children are getting tangled in barbed wire and drowning in the Rio Grande, Texas. I hope that we hear outrage of that from every single person in Congress. If Republicans are concerned about these kids, they would do everything in their power to make it safer for them to seek asylum. They would make it harder to exploit them and abuse them right here in our own country. Also, one of the solutions that seems to be on the minds of some of my Republican colleagues is claiming that the solution is to the exploitation of unaccompanied minors is to shut down immigration at the southern border. This approach is unconscionable and it's just un-American, and it's also untenable. Unaccompanied children are some of the most vulnerable among us, and the United States has a moral and legal obligation to ensure that those children are safe. I refuse to have us turn our backs on children fleeing war, violence, persecution, and abuse. We can address exploitation by making sure sponsor vetting reflects best practices and equip ORR to provide post-release services. And by having a 60% cut, which is what some of my colleagues want to do, is not a solution at all. But we should not tolerate the simplistic and inhumane proposal that the answer here is to shut down the southern border. It's time for us to get serious about how we can support these children and not inflict unnecessary cruelty on vulnerable children. I have a question for you, Secretary Becerra. How have state laws rolling back child labor protections impeded HHS's ability to serve and protect unaccompanied children after being released from OR custody?
Congressman, thank you for the question. And as you know, in order to be able to enforce laws that protect our children from exploitive labor, we need to have a partnership with our state partners, because it won't be enough to just try to do it through the Department of Labor at the federal level or with HHS. We need to work with our state partners. And if a state is actually diminishing its protections against child labor, it sure makes it tough for us to go out there and enforce against this type of exploitive practice.
I think by diminishing those local laws, it actually encourages bad actors across this country to just even do more. Have there been other efforts at the state level to restrict corporations with ORR? If so, what presented the greatest challenges?
Well, our challenges is trying to make sure we can spot where the exploitive activity will occur, and so we can make sure that any sponsor who wishes to take a child would not engage in that activity in cahoots with those employers. And so the more sight we have on that working with the Department of Labor, the more likely we'll be able to prevent the child exploitation that occurs.
So Department of Labor at the federal level, but there are also departments of labor at the local level in states, right?
In fact, they're more important because they are on the ground and have greater resources and personnel to try to protect labor laws, especially for children. The department at the federal level, Department of Labor, is very stretched, and we continue to do these partnerships so we can get the best efficiency out of our working together to protect these kids.
Well, I hope Congress gives you more resources to do the job that is needed to be done. My time having expired, I yield back. Thank you.
Gentleman yields back, and now recognize Ms. Harshbarger from Tennessee for her 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Thank you, Secretary Becerra, for being here. I've got several questions, or mainly yes or no's. The HHS Inspector General wrote in the fall of last year, quote, "Some staff reported that they were hesitant to raise concerns about case management and children's safety due to the fear of retaliation by ORR and facility leadership. In some cases, the reported actions of ORR and facility leadership may have risen to the level of whistleblower chilling." Mr. Secretary, under your leadership, has HHS ever threatened to transfer, remove, suspend, revoke the privileges, or dismiss anyone for raising concerns about ORR sponsors' vetting process, yes or no?
Congresswoman.
Well, it's just a yes or no, sir.
We do not threaten.
So that's a no. Would you tolerate, under your watch, suspending, transferring, removing, not promoting, revoking the privileges, or dismissing anyone for raising concerns about ORR policies, procedures, or actions taken?
We have a zero tolerance for any retaliation against whistleblowers.
Okay. The New York Times reported in April this year that an immigration lawyer, Linda Brandmiller, who helped vet sponsors for HHS, had her building access revoked, was fired within hours after emailing HHS about 2 potential sponsors she was concerned could be labor trafficking child migrants. Mr. Chairman, I ask unanimous consent to submit into the committee record the New York Times article dated April 17th, 2023.
And we will take that up at the
Okay.
conclusion, and I assume that we have copies of that.
Yes, yes, you do. Mr. Secretary, is the New York Times article right or wrong?
Is it right or wrong about what?
About the question, the statement I just made.
I'm sorry.
About Linda Brandmiller, who helped vet sponsors for HHS, that she had her building access revoked and was fired within hours after emailing HHS about a question about sponsors for labor trafficked child migrants.
As a former Attorney General who worked with and protected whistleblowers, I can tell you that now as Secretary, I do not tolerate on my watch any type of retaliation against whistleblowers.
So I guess you don't know.
Well,
Under
in
her
any-
leadership, was she
Congresswoman, in
threatened to
any
remove?
particular, on a specific case, as you know, I cannot comment on any case that may be
Okay.
before us.
Okay. According to the same New York Times article, Jalen Subalog, a senior HHS employee and lifelong Democrat, was moved out of her position after she informed congressional staff, the HHS Inspector General, and her bosses that some sponsors were falsifying identities to get unaccompanied migrants released to them. Did that happen, Mr. Secretary? Was she moved out of her position?
Congresswoman, again, we have zero tolerance for any retaliation.
It's just a yes
against
or no. If you
whistleblower.
don't know, just say you don't know.
It's that you're asking cases about specific, asking information and questions about a specific case, and as you know, I cannot comment on
Okay, no
ongoing
comment.
cases.
According to the New York Times, 2 people who were retaliated against for raising the concerns about sponsors. Do you dispute that New York Times article that under your leadership, HHS retaliated against at least 2 whistleblowers?
Again, I'd have to see this article, but we don't retaliate against whistleblowers.
Okay. so
Not
you
under my
don't know.
watch.
Okay. According to a February 2023 New York Times article, rather than listening to these concerns, you were pressuring HHS employees and contractors to rush more children through the system faster. According to the
inaccurate.
Times, you were captured on video saying to staff last summer, quote, "If Henry Ford had seen this in his plants, he would have never become famous and rich. This is not the way you do an assembly line," unquote. Is that how your administration is treating the release of unaccompanied minors, sir, like an assembly line that cannot stop to make sure that these minors are being released to a safe sponsor? And that's a yes or no.
Congressman, you may not have been here earlier. I responded to that question. The information relates to the process we were talking about, not people, when it comes to how we engage in an efficient process to get children where they need to be.
Okay. Mr. Chairman, I ask unanimous consent to submit into the committee record this February 25th, 2023.
That one's already
New
been
York Times.
requested, thank you.
Okay, thank you. Mr. Secretary, did you tell former ORR Director Secretary Cindy Huang that you would fire her if she didn't speed up the releases of UAC?
Congresswoman, as I said, I do not we do not tolerate anyone.
So
who
you don't
tries
know.
to-
Do you know
That's
why
not the-
Director
no, that's not
Huang
accurate.
retired?
That's
Do
not
you know
accurate.
why
I
she
didn't say that I
resigned?
didn't know. I have many conversations with the personnel at ORR. That is not a conversation I had with anyone.
Okay. Due to the surge in unaccompanied alien children arriving under the Biden administration, ORR set up temporary emergency intake sites to deal with demand. According to the HHS Officer Inspector General, one employee at an emergency intake site at Fort Bliss reported retaliation after raising issues about case management and child safety, which caused hesitation among other staff who wished to share concerns. And several staff interviewed by HHS OIG reported knowledge of staff who were allegedly dismissed or reassigned after expressing concerns. This is in addition to media reports of other retaliation against ORR staff and contractors who raised concerns. Are you concerned at all that HHS OIG found instances of retaliation against employees who raised those concerns, sir?
We work closely with the OIG anytime they do a report, and we follow their recommendations usually as quickly as we can. And I can say to you, once again, when it comes to whistleblowing, it is important that we protect those who are willing to come forward for good, open government. And at HHS, we don't tolerate anyone who would try to retaliate against whistleblowers.
Gentlelady yields back. Now recognize the gentlelady from California, Ms. Eshoo, for 5 minutes of questioning.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Good afternoon, Mr. Secretary. And thank you for allowing me to wave on to the subcommittee today. Like so many Americans, Mr. Secretary, I was really appalled by the New York Times investigative reports about the surge in illegal child labor in our country. We have a moral responsibility to ensure that children are not exploited on our watch. Before reading that investigative report, I would have responded if asked about child labor in our country and said that it was part of another century, that it's gone. But on the heels of that, I led 25 members in writing to you on May 25th about this horrible situation, and we got a response this morning. I've been poring over your letter since it's come in, but here are my questions. In the letter that I received this morning, Assistant Secretary Contreras writes that ORR's internal audit found that the agency, quote, adhered to its program policies and priorities designed to meet or exceed statutory requirements when vetting potential sponsors of unaccompanied children. Honestly, you know what that sounds like to me? Nothing is wrong. We did everything right. But there are some terrible things that are wrong, in my view, and I think in others. If ORR is, quote, meeting and exceeding its statutory requirements, A, why are we witnessing such an alarming rise in the exploitation of children discharged from the agency's custody? And B, have the children in the sites that they were found to be in, where they were located, factories, slaughterhouses, construction sites, have they been removed from those places?
Congresswoman, are you asking, have the children been removed from those work sites? That I could not answer because, again, as I said, you probably weren't here, but we've discussed how our authorities, our reach, once we have placed a child in a vetted sponsor's hands, we lose that responsibility.
Let me just say this.
jurisdiction.
I don't ever desire to be, or will I be, a secretary in a president's cabinet. But honestly, if this came on my watch, and even though that's not under my department, I would pick up the phone with the Department of Labor, the secretary, and say, I have some jurisdiction in this and it's a mess.
And we've
But
done
I
that.
just want to highlight
And we've done that.
where these children are. So that's why I
Congresswoman,
was
we've done
asking
that.
the question.
The Congresswoman, we've done that. We've done more. We actually entered into a formal agreement with
But
the
so they have have they been removed from these sites? I mean, they're 13 and 14-year-olds working in slaughterhouses, factories, and
enforcement, Congresswoman, with the Department of Labor, I can take back to them the questions that you're asking about whether there's been enforcement at those work sites.
The New York Times reports that, and this was raised by another member, that you told Cindy Wong that, quote, if she could not increase the number of discharges, that is of unaccompanied children, you would find someone that could. I heard your answer. You don't deny that you've said it, but you won't say that you did because you can't talk about it. I think we need to do better. That's my real point. I don't need to ask the question again. But this is so unsettling. This is so unsettling. These are well, I guess at my age I would call them babies. But these are the innocents of the world. And this is really terrible. And I think that the reporting of your threatening to fire her under, undue pressure to expedite releases, I hope you've gone back to review that. I don't know if you have. Let me ask you if you've gone back to review releases. I mean, is there too much speed and not precision relative to the children and their lives and their well-being?
Congresswoman, as I've said before, I have not threatened anyone, and I do not threaten people.
So did you speak to this reporter and say, or your shop say to this reporter,
I
this
never
is
spoke-
totally inaccurate?
I never spoke to that reporter.
Did you read the full investigative report?
Which
The
investigative?
New York
report?
Times?
I read the article. I don't know if it was an investigative report. It was an article. It had a lot of information that I think misunderstands the way ORR operates. And there's information in there that's based on
Well, my time has expired,
third-party
but I just want to say that reports of trafficking and abuse of immigrant children has more than doubled from 21 to 22. Really, at the end of the day, as HHS Secretary, the buck stops with you. So I can hope, I can pray, I can press. Other members have, members from both sides of the aisle. This is something that needs to be totally removed from taking place in our country. Really, I think that God's going to hold all of us responsible if this is not addressed and addressed the way it should.
Gentlelady yields back.
Thank you, and I yield back.
Now recognize the gentleman from Georgia, Mr. Carter, for his 5 minutes of questioning.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and thank you for allowing me to wave on to this subcommittee. Mr. Secretary, I've been waiting for your return to Congress. Last time, we had some unfinished business. I want to shift gears a little bit, if that's okay. I appreciate my colleagues' concern about unaccompanied children. I share their concerns. But I have another concern, and it's about the Inflation Reduction Act, specifically about the prescription portion of that. You and I have spoken about this before, this committee as well as on the Budget Committee. And you have expressed and you've said it's your personal belief that the Inflation Reduction Act would lead to more cures being developed by the same pharmaceutical and biotech companies whose research and development you're fixing to slash. As you know, professionally, I'm a pharmacist. And I have seen nothing short of miracles as a result of research and development. And that's why this is so important to me. I've watched families suffer. I've seen children lose parents. I've seen parents lose children. And it's very important to me that we continue with the research and development and the new drugs that I've witnessed in my career, drugs that have been nothing short of miracles. And yet, again, you maintained and said at the last time that I had the opportunity to ask you questions that you believe that the Inflation Reduction Act is going to result in more cures. Whereas researchers at the University of Chicago said that the IRA will eliminate up to 342 cures over the next 20 years. The biotech firm, research firm Vital Transformation predicts that up to 139 drugs will not be developed over the next decade because of the IRA, and that up to 49 treatments currently on the market would not have existed had the IRA been in effect. Even the Congressional Budget Office, the CBO, our economists here in Congress, even they said that it's going to eliminate treatments and cures that would have otherwise been developed. We've already had drugs that have been pulled by pharmaceutical manufacturers as a result of this. And yeah, I know there's a pending lawsuit as well from some of the pharmaceutical manufacturers, and I'm sure you're aware of that. I know you are. I just have to ask you, Mr. Secretary, what makes you right and these other agencies wrong? I don't get it.
Congressman, thank you for the question, and I hope you'll agree that no American should be paying 2 to 3 times the price for a drug, oftentimes manufactured.
I understand that. I'm the one that was at the counter having to tell the senior citizen what the price of a medication was and watching them try to make a decision between buying groceries and buying their medicine. I'm the one who watched the mother in tears as she tried to get the antibiotic for her child, trying to figure out how she was going to pay for it. I'm doing everything I can humanly to bring down prescription drug prices, but I do not and I will not stand by while this administration, while this agency stops research and development that I have witnessed over the past 40 years in practicing pharmacy that has resulted in miracles.
Congressman, my response would be that increased competition helps stimulate more production, more innovation, and the more we can lower prices, the more we're going to have that competition. And so if we're ever going to get those prices down of those drugs that cost us 2 or 3 times more than they cost in other parts of the world, it will be because we're able to negotiate to get good prices and encourage not only competition, but innovation.
This is going to result, and you know as well as I do that you're missing. This is a swing and a miss. It's not, yeah, the pharmaceutical manufacturers need to do better, but you know that it's the middleman, you know that it's the PBM, the insurance companies that are doing this.
Congressman, when you have people who today are paying $35 for their insulin instead of $100, $200, that's not a miss. That's a win.
That's a win for the co-payments, but it's not going to bring down the price of the insulin.
Well, we just saw that 3 other companies have agreed to do the same thing for
with the copay.
Yeah, and that's great
Mr.
news.
Secretary, again, the CBO, all of the University of Chicago, all of these have said that this is going to result in fewer cures. What makes them wrong? Why are they wrong and you're right?
Congress, we know that if you stimulate competition and innovation, you'll have better drugs at a better
Do they know that? I'm sure they know that as well, but they are saying, and I'm just baffled by the fact that you're saying that you're right and everybody else is wrong. I was always taught,
I'm not
son, when
saying
it seems like everybody else is wrong and you're the only ones who's right, you got to stop for a minute and think, it might not be everybody else.
Congressman, I'm not saying I'm right. I'm implementing the law that Congress passed. I didn't say that.
No.
You said that.
No. But you continue to go this route in this administration. Again, I have to tell you, I didn't come up here for some egotistical trip. I came up here because I was the one on the other side of the counter. I was the one who had to tell the senior citizens. I was the one who had to tell the patient. I'm going to do something about that. But I'm not going to let this administration, I'm not going to let this agency stop research and development of miracle drugs that I've witnessed in my career. Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and I yield back.
Gentleman yields back and now recognize our last witness, Mr. Joyce of Pennsylvania. Thank you, Mr. Secretary. We're closed, I know.
Mr. Secretary, thank you for agreeing to appear before us today. And thank you, Chairman Griffith, for allowing me to wave on. Secretary Becerra, in March of 2022, the Foundation for Government Accountability submitted multiple FOIA requests to CMS seeking information on the enforcement of hospital price transparency rules. After CMS prolonged delay in complying, a court subsequently ordered CMS to produce all the required documents by April of 2023. Although CMS has provided nearly 2,000 pages of documents, I would like to raise 2 concerns. First, based on FGA's initial review of the documents, it appears that CMS is not adequately enforcing the hospital price transparency rule. Secondly, CMS is withholding over 38,000 pages of responsive documents claiming trade secret exemptions. First, Mr. Secretary, can you tell us today what percentage of hospitals are in compliance with the price transparency rule?
Congressman, thank you for the question. It is an important subject. I apologize that I came prepared to talk about the unaccompanied children program. We can try to get, I asked my team.
Thank you. I would appreciate the follow-up. Do you feel that CMS has taken the appropriate and necessary actions to enforce this rule to date?
Congressman, CMS has been working very hard to implement any number of regulations and statutes that are now in place as a result of Congress's passage of these new laws. I can try to get back to you on some.
Thank you. I think that information is important. Would you agree that by withholding the documents that I mentioned above, that CMS is giving the impression that CMS is afraid of what the public might uncover through this FOIA effort?
Congressman, CMS has been working very hard to implement the different laws that are now in place that Congress has passed. I can try to get back to you.
Thank you. I think revealing that information would be definitely so important when we're dealing with an issue such as transparency. Further, on that topic of transparency, recent research conducted by the American Academy of Otolaryngology, the Head and Neck Surgery Foundation, has brought attention to significant price disparities between the average sales price and the prices charged by hospitals for certain cancer therapies. The study reveals that some hospitals are charging markups as high as 300% above the ASP for these therapies. We believe that it is imperative to address these issues to ensure fair pricing, transparency, and accessibility of medications for all patients. How do you plan to address this practice and ensure that patients are not burdened with exorbitant costs for life-saving treatments?
Congressman, we continue to move forward with the implementation of the very important price transparency law, as well as the No Surprises Act that you all passed that makes sure that consumers, patients, are not burdened with unexpected bills, that they have a chance to understand what their bill might be if they go into a hospital. I can try to follow up with you with any of those questions. I apologize that I came more prepared.
I thank you. I think that you're addressing transparency with us in drug pricing, as recently mentioned with questioning, is essential for patients. They need to have that transparency to make informed decisions, specifically regarding their medical care. What steps will you take to promote greater transparency in hospital pricing for cancer therapies to prevent excessive markups and ensure affordability for patients?
Congressman, we continue to try to make sure that we're implementing not just the letter of the law on price transparency, but the spirit, which means every American should be able to understand what the charge would be for the services they're about to get. No one wants to be blindsided. So we continue to implement. Obviously, as you know, as you stated, there are a lot of folks, a lot of stakeholders who don't like the law that you all passed, because that means they have to be more open and transparent. So we're going to continue to do the work. We look forward to working with you on that.
And I think to that endpoint, and I appreciate you offering to bring forth that percentage of hospitals that are in compliance with the transparency rule, I think as this committee works towards transparency, works towards access of the greatest therapies in America for these patients who are undergoing significant hardships as they face cancer therapy and cancer treatment. I thank you again, Secretary Becerra, for being here with us today. Mr. Chairman, once again, I thank you for allowing me to wave on, and I yield the remainder of my time. Thank you.
I thank the gentleman for yielding back. Seeing there are no further members wishing to ask questions, I would like to thank our witness again for being here today. Secretary Becerra, thank you. I know that some of the questions were not directly on point on what we want to talk about, but most of them were. And you agreed to get back with some of those questions where you were not expected to be prepared today, and I appreciate that. Pursuant to committee rules, I remind members that they have 10 business days to submit additional questions for the record, and I ask the witness to respond within 10 business days upon receipt of those questions. And I also ask unanimous consent to insert in the record the documents included on the staff hearing documents list. Without objection, that will be the order, and this subcommittee is adjourned.